Okay, can you hear me now? I was having a full blown on conversation with myself. um, for those of you who are on, please get those likes up. And I was saying just a special shout out to David H for the $20 super chat. Again, I will read. He asked, for about a week now, I've been in a few circles of women bringing up toxic and fragile masculinity. So I ask, what does good, manly masculinity look and sound like? The silence that follows speaks volume. So I think you are going to find this particular discussion really helpful. I'm really excited about today's special guest. I have had just the opportunity to listen to some of his different content and some of the different things that he's expressed, and he comes with a wealth of knowledge. Many of you guys have already heard of him. So we're going to be talking about Black masculinity and just many things pertaining to the Black community in general. So again, if you are on here, please get those likes up, tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting, useful. Also, if you would like to show support to the show, you can find me on CASHAPP or VENMO ChezCharde. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on our special guest. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I am good. I am so excited to have you on. And I'm so excited to just hear your perspective on some of these different topics. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to join me this evening and enjoy my followers. This will be fun.
I appreciate it. It's during grading season, so I need a little bit of a break. So
yeah,
it was a good time. Yeah, it was a good time.
Both of my parents, as I mentioned before, are teachers. Well, one's a teacher, my dad's a professor. So all I can say is I get it.
Yeah, we'll talk.
Yes. Well, I mean, without further ado, I just want to get right into today's topic.
Okay.
As I mentioned to the followers before, we're going to be talking a little bit about Black masculinity, something that you obviously are very familiar with. But for those of you who have not heard of you, do you mind just maybe giving a quick introduction about what you do and some of your different specialties?
Okay. I'm Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State, founder of the Institute for Black Male Studies, which you can find for instituteforblackmalestudies.com. And my work has principally been on Black men and boys, the vulnerability of Black men and boys, and actually, beginning a dialogue amongst Black men about what types of policies can actually improve the quality of life for Black men and boys. So that's kind of my general focus there, I would say.
Okay, awesome. So with that, I want to ask you the first question. How, there's this talk I hear a lot about femininity and masculinity. And I think it's very rare that I actually hear people define what it is. So how would you define Black masculinity?
Well, I mean, I think you're basically, on its most generic level, you're talking about the qualities and characteristics of Black men and boys But we know that alongside that, culturally and politically, these are things that Black men and boys themselves have developed in response to communal expectation, familial expectation, and as
Right.
well as navigating white supremacy. So dealing with the realities of all of those different layers of Black life, uh,
Mm,
ideas about manhood, ideas about male roles, gender roles in particular. Black men have, developed various responses to that, and much of it is pressured and shaped by environment. So
fair.
when you see, a widespread kind of set of behaviors amongst Black men, that's when you start to you have to raise the question: what are the environmental conditions that produce this, right? But
Mm,
generically speaking, when we talk about Black masculinity, that's roughly what we're speaking about. And of course, there are all kinds of dimensions to that, especially if you involve LGBTQ, and a lot of those narratives since the 80s have really forced people to really question gender roles and where they come from and what's socially constructed and what's biologically determined. And all of those things are
yeah.
factors to the conversation. Yeah.
Mm, very, very interesting. So really, I mean, you said there's just the basic understanding of, masculinity, what it means to be a man, but then
Mhm.
specifically Black masculinity there's a lot of different factors. Culture, obviously, perception, the different unique traumas and different challenges that
Absolutely.
are associated with that really defines or makes a Black masculinity.
And this is a very unique culture, a unique group of men and boys, because you're talking
Hmm.
about a group that was, for the most part, taken, put in
Yeah.
an entirely different context, and then, outside of labor, framed to fail, right? And so
Mm,
for Black men, to succeed, however you define that, it is definitely against the grain. It's definitely not something that society has planned for or supported to any great extent.
fair.
It's nonetheless what Black men are navigating. So there's a lot of layers to that. I don't want to oversimplify it, but that is where I would start the conversation.
No, that makes so much sense. And it sounds like based upon the definition, then where you're defining it, like you use the example of within America, obviously, it's
Mhm.
unique because it's like many Black men, are, the descendants of slaves who obviously they had a history prior to that.
Right.
But historically, the understanding of most of us is just that. It's, Jim Crow with slavery. Whereas let's say you're in, Africa, for example, where you can trace your lineage back generations, that definition may change a bit. So, if I'm understanding correctly what you mean.
Sure. I mean, we're talking about a group of people that were taken from different places and in many ways kind of
Yeah.
thrown together and kind of filtered through a forced experience going through the Caribbean, South America, all the way up to North America, and it's like scattered and sold about. So, there's going to be all kinds of dimensions to this discussion that you could literally take semesters, pulling apart. So, and we do in some of my classes. So it's, a lot of what I'm telling you is just very surface level in that respect, but it does feed into a lot of the nuance of what Black men navigate. You
No, very, very interesting. Um, okay, let me see and on to the next question. Also, special shout out to Omawali, Africa.
You said it.
I see a little something for the collection plate. On a side note, Dr. Johnson looks like a giant next to you on the screen. Great talk. Oh, he's over here poking fun.
Mhm.
For those of you who are on, please get those likes up, tag anybody, or share this discussion with anybody who think may find it interesting. We are talking about Black masculinity, specifically Black women, and whether or not they are taught to fear Black masculinity, and so much more. So on to the next question. So,
Okay.
how do you differentiate like hyper or toxic masculinity versus real or healthy masculinity among Black men?
You know, Part of what makes that question, really complicated is that we have to factor in media, because we
Mm,
live in a time frame where
yeah,
media
that's facts.
shapes so much of our reality. I mean, it's pervasive. You know what I mean? And it's grown so quickly. I mean, I don't want to sound like the old man, but I do this in my class all the time. I remember the first cell phone call I was on. You know what I mean? I remember the first time I logged into the internet. I mean, these things
Mm,
now they're such a part of our reality. So when
yeah.
you talk about what kinds of images and ideas we're being given, I mean, it comes from so many directions. It's sometimes difficult to parse through the difference. But what I try and separate between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity is that much of the time in popular media, what we're being told toxic masculinity is especially in the Black community, it's the actions of less than a fraction of a percent of Black men that
Fact.
somehow get cast onto the majority.
Yeah.
And you end up hearing discussions, especially for those of us who were raised in single mother homes, where you hear this kind of discussion of what Black men are capable of, what they did, and they'll quote movies, stories. A friend of a friend of a friend went through this. A great grandparent went through this, and this is what Black men are.
Mm.
And yet, if you actually ask them, much of the time, "Why have you experienced this?" You get all kinds of mental gymnastics. But
Right.
but a lot of that is because we've taken these ideas in, men too, and boys, taking all these ideas in from popular media, and we forced them into our frame in terms of how we see men. So for me, toxic masculinity is really rooted in what media has portrayed about a very small percentage of Black men and put against the entire group. But when you actually look at the aggregate, if you step back and look at Black male behavior in terms of employment, in terms of roles in the family, time spent with children, if you look at it in terms of sacrifices made for loved ones, if you look at it in terms of political activity and activism, but not just the traditional activism you see on television where you got to be in the streets holding the signs, but who are the ones coaching? Who are the ones giving up time after work to go work with young boys? And those are the kind of dimensions that we have to look to for healthy dimensions of masculinity. And what you'll find more often than not is that there's more than enough to talk about. But as long as we base our conversation on what we've internalized from media, it's always going to be a warped conversation. This is why on my show, The Honest Report, one of the things I start with every week when I do a live, I have a segment where I call it Sacred Black Masculine. And that's basically where we shout out whatever runs across my desk that week, but is something representative of Black male humanity. The kinds of exploits that Black men engage in that are really common. But for some reason, because of how our media representation is kind of portrayed, kind of comes across as if it isn't. But it is actually quite common. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that I do that. But it really is an uphill battle. I mean, I was one of those kids in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, raised in the 80s, and I came of age watching and reading. Like my mother had me read Color Purple like 3 or 4 times.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And she took me to, all of those, I won't say all of them, but she took me to some choice Oprah Winfrey, Terry McMillan films kind of thing. And, and that was her and her girlfriends. And I'd sit in on the war councils as a little kid, or I might be walking to and from the kitchen, listening to the discussions and, of course, all of that. But you heard these kind of narratives being internalized and represented as the sole expression of Black women's experiences with Black men. And there was always, moments of irony that was hard to get people to recognize, And so we can talk a little bit about that, as we go. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of that shapes how we even start the conversation on Black males.
So you're saying, which I certainly agree that so much negativity or negative mindset that is associated with the Black men is largely shaped not only by this culture but perpetuated by media, and then the different ways that we can to continue to consume that as people.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. And that's one of the reasons so many men have talked to me about difficulty communicating, because if they fall outside of the traditional narratives, Black masculinity, they're virtually unseen. They talk about how difficult it is to actually be engaged unless they express certain tropes that are received in the larger culture, even amongst Black women, even amongst the Black community. So that said, there's definitely a set of scripts, if you will, that people are kind of trained to follow in order to be visible or in order to be worthy of identification in many respects. And if you fall outside of the narrative, you have a much harder time trying to kind of be seen. But we don't question the scripts enough and where they come from.
Yeah, no, I think I think that is. I mean, you're spot on. I've talked to different friends about this, where myself, where I say, I think as African American women, I can say that I think we see that many of us are encouraged or taught how to even desire or look for the wrong things in a partner. And I was actually just talking about this with someone earlier today. Actually, this was a white woman, and we were talking about this, and she was like, "Well, this does happen across all different cultures." But I told her, I think the key difference is like, whereas I have a Chinese friend, for example, where she can mess around in college, but she knows when she goes back home, if she brings home a certain kind of person, she's going to lose her inheritance. You know what I mean? And there's like social consequences that certain people have for actually doing, or choosing the wrong thing. But it just seems like within Black culture, like we as women, we kind of encourage, or we go after this hyper toxic masculine kind of gentleman, especially in our younger years. And there's no social consequences for doing so like there are in other cultures. And so now by the time we're 30 and 40, and the good guys that we never really gave a chance, they're now, some of them are married off to Becky or Marisol. Some of them are just like, forget it. I don't want to be with Black women because they didn't want me when I was building, and I think some of that is like, we're not, as women, we're not even trained how to appreciate the right things. We're looking at the athletes, we're looking at the entertainers, the rappers.
Those are those kids. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're overlooking the, the lawyers, the engineers, the teachers, the professors, the different men who are actually building and keeping society functioning. Like we overlook that as if it's just kind of lame. And I'm like, I think that kind of feeds into it.
That's definitely something I've talked to many a man about, especially if you're not in one of those, areas. If you're, like you said, if you're a teacher or, something along those lines where you don't fall into athlete, entertainer.
Yeah.
Or there's almost a cognitive dissonance where people just kind of don't know how to look at you in certain respects, and women in particular, and how to frame your, social value. Right. But part of that, we have to actually begin to ask the question, how did this come about? Because it wasn't always the case. I mean, even during my lifetime, it wasn't. My grandmother never looked at my grandfather and said, does he make six figures? You know what I mean? She never looked at him and say and asked the question, well, how many degrees did he have? She didn't ask those kinds of questions. It was a very different era. So within my lifetime, we've seen this major shift. And one of the things I try to talk about is the way in which policy can shape behavior, especially on a macro level. And if the policies in place incentivize women to go it alone because men can be replaced, one of the things you have is a culture that over time begins to shift in a manner where, and I was just talking to a subscriber to my channel yesterday, and she was telling me exactly what I was saying. She said, she came from 3 generations at least. She had grandmothers, mothers, aunties, cousins, and family friends, all women, who would advise her along the same route, in terms of what kind of man she should look for, what type of man she should bring home. And of course, if he upset her, what kind of things, what kind of legal means she could use to either punish him, you know what I mean, or get resources out of him. But the sole component to that was that, from the man she chose to the kinds of policies she could use on her behalf, much of it was centered around control. Right. These policies put Black women in a position in the family where they are in primary control, and can actually serve in that. So you choose men who are not going to be a threat to that dynamic. Right. You're able to identify those men, be with those men. Those men appear to be very, hyper masculine, as you pointed out earlier in your question. But at the end of the day, especially if they have a record, or especially if they're vulnerable, they're low employment, whatever the dynamic may be, if you're in a top position and you're choosing men that are in a questionable position, a lot of that comes about because the kind of culture we have is one where women are actually urging their daughters and granddaughters to serve in a position of control and of power. This is something I call the gynopaestal family structure in the Black community, where you have spheres of women. How do I put this? So I met a woman on a dating app years ago. She was I'd say in her 40s. We had a nice little conversation, and she started to tell me about her family structure. So her grandmother, who was the matriarch of the family, of course, ran her household. And she had several daughters, herself included. They ran their households. And then they had daughters, and they ran their households. And to the extent that there were some sons mixed in there, those sons were trained and socialized to serve in another woman's household in another family. So there was a sort of anticipation that he would be brought into another gynopaestal network. So here you have networks of women-controlled houses and families that are using and referencing everything from welfare to family court to maintain positions of power within those families, and choosing men that are vulnerable to those kinds of tactics. And after you do that for 2 or 3 generations,
wow,
what do you have?
That's very interesting. I never thought of it that way. But I mean, I'm not the only Black woman that is heard, like all the survival tactics, right? Get your education, make sure you can take care of yourself, make sure you do X, Y, Z, A, B, and C, so that when he leaves you, right?
Right.
When he leaves you, you'll be able to take care of it. I mean, many of us have heard this from friends, older
Mhm.
friends, maybe aunties, cousins. Some
Yeah,
of us are mothers, some of us, close, whatever. But that common narrative, like that expectation of when the dude that you choose decides to walk off,
yeah,
you're taken care of.
absolutely.
And not that I'm against, I certainly think it's okay and it's good for women to know how to, take care of themselves and be functioning adults. Like
Mhm.
that's just common sense. But it's like there's this fear-based narrative that we have that many of us have heard for years, and it's mind-boggling to be perfectly honest.
Well, I think when you talk about having an adult perspective that protects one's well-being, that's almost kind of a defensive thing where if this
Mm,
situation occurs, I know that these resources are here for me to defend. But I
right.
think part of what we're talking about has gone from defensive to offensive. I think it's become somewhat
Mm,
predatory in some kind of forms of it where it, like you said earlier, when he leaves. See, that's an
right.
offensive gesture. That's not, well, if the relationship doesn't go well, what can I do? That's when he leaves, I will do X, Y, and Z. And so that in and of itself, again, is part of a series of responses to the environment, right? Where you have people that are socialized to respond in very particular ways. And much of this in the Black community has really been framed in a very gender split manner. So,
Yes.
we can talk about, historically welfare, college access. We can talk about the current programs going on with the Ford Foundation, going on with Goldman Sachs, Google, Visa, MasterCard, and I can list a number of others, or even the policies and practices that came about in the last year during the pandemic to support Black women run entrepreneurial businesses. You never heard mention of Black male entrepreneurial businesses. So,
Yeah,
what does
you
that
don't.
do to a community when you only have, now there are programs, of course, for Black folk as in general, but I've
Mm,
run into Black men that have had to go get sisters and cousins to be the female face of their business just to get support, right? So
that's
what does
crazy.
that do?
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah. And I liken it to kind of like moving into an area and gentrifying the area, right? If you're going to come in
Mm,
and buy up all the property and create a new buffer class, well, that's how you kind of do it. You come in, you identify the group you want to, exploit, but really do so by giving them opportunities, and then you have another group you ignore entirely. What does that do in a general sense? But then you fine tune that a bit. How does that affect actual relationships? If relationship after relationship after relationship, you see the same kind of dynamics of who has certain types of support and who's struggling. Well, over time, you're going to develop a perspective about that. You're going to
yeah,
develop
no,
an attitude
absolutely.
about each group.
Man, man, you just said a ton there. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting or useful. We are talking about Black masculinity and whether or not Black women are taught to fear or honor Black masculinity. I also want to give a special shout out to Game Dreamer 58. Keep up the great work. And I want to give an especially big shout out to Miss Delta Guy for the $100 super chat. Again, much love and support. I appreciate all of it. And it looks like I got another one in. Special shout out to Raw for the $5 super chat. I see, let the electricity go out in every Black city for just a week. You have Black women rumbling each other to find a husband. Life is just too easy now.
You know,
Actually,
that,
it's facts.
you know
That is
that's interesting. Yeah, I was talking about that. I think it was like a year and a half
Oh
ago.
man.
We saw that kind of dynamic happening where the economy was starting to dip. And this was around the time period where Trump was sending out food boxes. I don't know if you remember that a little while ago. And all of a sudden, brothers were writing into me on how they were getting these hey big head texts.
Hey.
I'm going back from 20, women from 20 years ago. Like,
That's
are you
crazy.
single? What's going on? And it was really like a big game of musical chairs. Can you grab somebody before all hell broke loose? It really gets to that point. So yeah, there's some reality to that. And of
It's
course, the
almost
pandemic revealed that too.
right. It's almost as if singleness is a luxury, is
Oh,
is a modern luxury.
hmm oh yeah, very much so. And what it takes to be single and be, and this is something we hear a lot, especially in the manosphere, where the question is, all right, do you have enough to retire on? What will that take?
Mm,
And I think Kevin Samuels is one of the ones that points that out the most. If you need X amount to retire on, do you have that as a single person? And I think a lot of people have a very fantastical view of how money works and how much they need and so on and so forth. It's we really have to get realistic about that.
yeah, that's facts. That is total facts. Again, for those of you who are on, please get those likes up. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting. So on to the next question. Um, in your opinion, are Black women taught to respect or fear Black masculinity? Why or why not?
I think in many ways, and this goes to what I was talking about earlier. I think Black women and girls are trained to fear it, Black masculinity in some respects, definitely, especially as it pertains to, like as you said earlier, when he leaves. Right, the ideas about the family, what role he's going to play, and I think in response, you have a kind of sense that men, can be more easily dealt with as sperm donors. Um, and maybe as occasional protection here and there, but at the end of the day they become utilities, because investing more in that is terrifying, right? So I think there is some fear-based decision making going on, but I think on a larger scale, the way I kind of frame it is that Black men have in many ways been trained to serve. They've been trained to see themselves as utilities. They've been trained to value themselves based on their utility, and to not request anything in return, not to really even have a sense of a standard beyond
Mm,
the obvious. And I think a lot of that comes out of a culture where, you have female led environment where women will actually raise sons based on, what their idealization of a good man is. But
yeah,
that's kind
facts.
of like building a car where you just have the frame of it and it looks nice, but there's no engine in it because you don't know how to build that. So you have a lot of men, and my generation did this as well. We performed masculinity based on the bits and images we saw in the environment and through media, right? And
Mm,
we kind of piecemealed some kind of sense of masculinity together, but nobody wanted to talk about why. Nobody wanted to ask the question why so many
mm,
fathers were gone. We just were told that they were trifling and they didn't. And I've heard this even in graduate school doing my master's at Temple, that Black men don't value family. I'm like,
mm. Wow,
are you serious? This was,
very interesting.
you know what I mean?
Very
So yeah,
interesting.
yeah, there's definitely a lot of that.
Hmm. Yeah, like I said, they're
I didn't
just
know if I missed any.
none. I'm sorry.
I didn't know if I missed your question or anything though.
No, no, no. I think you're spot on. It's just, it's funny because so many of these questions are they're layered. It's not just like
Yeah.
a simple, oh, yes or no, or just this one thing. It's like, you've spoken to policies, you've spoken to, I mean, the unique trauma that we've experienced as African Americans, and then you've spoken to, the different things that have been done in law versus, the media, the mindset, the brainwashing. Like, there's all these different things that are navigating at one time, at the same time, to kind of help define the way that we interact.
Yeah.
Um, I will say, and I've had to bite my tongue because I'm still rather newer on the YouTube space. I've been here about 10 months,
Mhm.
and before I got on, my husband, he warned me. He was like, "Oh, you're gonna see a lot of like misandry, especially like Black male misandry stuff on the YouTube." And I'm like, whatever. Like, I was like, I don't. What are you talking about? Like, that's not even my focus. I'm just here to just have a conversation. Like, I guess I just didn't really fully believe him. Like, I knew it was out there, but I
Mhm.
didn't know that it was such a thing. And then, here I am now 10 months later, and I'm seeing, after, doing my own research, looking at some of the other major female pro-Black, right, content creators, and I'm listening to their narratives and I'm hearing the things that they're saying, and I'm like, I don't know how else to say this other than just saying that this is like misandrist. Like, literally, they are pushing Black male hatred, and I'm like, you are a pro-Black woman pushing this stuff. And I was a little bit humbled, I guess, because I guess I didn't know it was so pervasive, and see it being so mainstream to me was the most disheartening. Especially when there's things being said that are either just they're downright incorrect, Just downright
Mhm,
statistically, it's just this is incorrect, or
mhm.
it's anecdotal experience. Yeah, for example, like I've had colorist experiences. I've had, black men say certain things that weren't nice, but I can't sit here and say no, all black men want Becky. I'm like, I know statistically that's just not true. Although I've had my own experiences and I hear a lot of anecdote and misunderstanding or misuse of statistics to kind of continue to perpetuate this narrative that I don't find being helpful. I don't find help that it's helping to solve the problem. This is me
Right.
personally.
No, I
So,
understandable, but I think a lot of people miss the significance of the moment.
mm,
When you look at when you again, first of all, I'm in the academy. I'm on campus, and if you say
okay.
gender is synonymous with female, synonymous with so there's no real mention of men unless men are framed as a problem to women. But so that being said, when I say there's a gender movement happening right now with men across race and across class, most
Yeah.
people don't see it as such because what we're familiar with when we say gender movement is more what we saw in the late 60s and 70s with feminists,
Women.
out
Yeah.
protesting, burning bras. You had black feminists rising up in the 80s talking about intersectionality and all these kinds of
Mm,
things. Black male gender movements and male gender movements in general are not presenting that way. And part of the reason for that is because the presentation is different. Black men in particular have never really had a major platform short of hip hop to talk about
no.
their
Yeah.
issues with masculinity. And the problem with hip hop is, especially in the late 80s and 90s, you kind of, it was really a small subset of men. You had, late teenagers, early 20 guys who were talking about their experiences in the club or in the street. And they were actually responding to the Oprah Winfrey's. They were actually responding to
Mm,
the Angela Davises about their experiences with women and how it's different than how Black feminists present it. But most people don't really identify that conversation as being responsive to what was happening in terms of feminism. And other than that, all you really had for Black men were the barbershops, and you had
yeah.
key individual artists that presented ideas. So occasionally you might get oh goodness, what's the brother's name? Alex Alexander O'Neill, who'll do a song like "Fake," or you'll get Eddie Murphy, who'll talk about divorce. I mean, when he did Raw, and he was talking about Johnny Carson's divorce, that was huge because it was one of those moments where you heard men starting to talk about something that they all kind of had a perspective about, but no major platform to share it. Meanwhile, Black
Mm,
women were getting these movies, these films, these television talk shows, and in
yeah.
the academy, they were starting to build and grow and be able to, boost careers. You couldn't get a degree in men's studies, and still can't in many respects unless you go to Scotland with my colleague Dr. Curry. So these kind of discussions boomed in one context only and the other didn't. So it's in the last decade, roughly speaking, where you have men in social media, right, which is
Yeah.
free, easily
Right. Right.
accessible. And this is where you have the movement taking place, and you have generations of frustration, of questions, of
Television.
perspectives, of philosophies booming. So yeah, if you come into it, it's going to look like the Colosseum, and in many respects, it has to, because but the importance of it is you actually have a cross race, cross class dialogue that's
Mm,
happening that we've really never seen before. And there's a lot of potential for that, but there was no other space for men to really go to even communicate with one another. And so one of the problems I have is when people say, well, we got all of this, misogyny on one side, and we got this misandry on the other, and we just need
mm,
to. It's like, wait a minute, wait. First of all, you have with men and Black men in particular, you have years of all kinds of things that haven't been able to be expressed being
right.
highly debated in one space for the first time. And on
Mm,
the other side, you have something that we've heard in the academy, in the street, in the salon, in households, and it's been backed and financed by state resources, by
mm-hmm.
academic resources, philanthropic resources. They're very different discussions. Black feminism, in particular, has had at least 40 years of investment. Where you've had hundreds of millions of dollars, even with BLM, just in the last few years, we've seen that alone with
Mm-hmm.
an organization that's prioritized Black women. We've not seen that with Black men. So you can't equate the two. And for one thing, all these guys on YouTube are not funded by anybody. They're coming out of their own pocket to produce
Yep.
content like you are.
Yep.
And the best they're getting are donations. So they're very different orientations. but this moment is very pregnant in terms of what can come out of it. But it's not been seen before, so we don't know where it's going. But at the very least, they're expressing ideas that after 20 years in higher education, I've had to go outside of the academy to be able to engage.
And I mean, what you said, like I said, there's so much behind it, because I mean, obviously there's a layer of just men in general being disheartened because of feminism, because of different economic struggles that are going on, the different policies, and then obviously there's the unique challenge that African American men have had, where I mean, the misandry, right, towards Black men, that's pretty much foundational to this nation's history and the way that it's
Mhm.
progressed, the way that it was built, the way it's been maintained. And so it's like there's again that unique misandry that is Black males' experiences, and the fact that there's never ever been a place where that's even been accepted. I mean, I remember talking to a family member about this, maybe a couple of years back, and I was asking them about Black men asking about their feelings,
Mm.
and they said nobody cares about my feelings. And I kind of I was shocked, because I'm like, I'm kind of wanting to engage in an emotional discussion, and I'm asking like, so why haven't these certain things happen, or what do you think about this? And his response is, no one's ever cared about my feelings, so why would I
Oh, yeah.
why would I talk about that? And it
Oh, yeah.
kind of like I like thought about that, and I was like, I didn't really know how to take it, because I guess I just wasn't really expecting that response. But when I really thought about it societally, it's like just men in general, there's just certain things a man in general is not going to get sympathy from. And then you
Mhm.
add to that, obviously, again, the issues that Black men in particular face because of the different stereotypes, the media, just the institution of racism, the different policies and things that have been done to systematically remove men, and to create division between men and women. So it's like it's like even the idea of Black men saying, hey, we have feelings too, we're people.
Mhm.
I mean, it seems like it can create such an uproar. It's like, how
Yeah,
dare you, how dare you,
absolutely.
usurp your humanity.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
it's not something that men are definitely asked about in regard to emotion, because if anything, they're punished for it. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
this was something you heard in
almost
the '80s, where you heard women saying, "We want to hear more about how you feel and what's going on," and then for men that tried to do that, it was definitely not
it
considered
didn't,
attractive,
right.
to emote in certain kinds of ways. The only emotions that I think are somewhat, acceptable when it comes to men are, kind of anger and certain gestures of, appreciation as it pertains to women and girls. But other than that, the full range of human emotion is denied to many Black men. And to your point about, the role racism or white supremacy plays in regard to its direct impact on men, there's a paper I would suggest people look up, written by my colleague, Dr. Tommy Curry. And I think the subtitle is Racism as Misandric Aggression. And it has
Mm,
to do with, the way we think about racism is very different from the way it operates. And the way it
mm,
actually operates is to identify and attack the men, right, in a very particular way. And we don't want to see it that way because we've been trained to see it as, this equal field where Black men and women are just this one group called Black, and everything that's racist attacks the entire group. But when you actually begin to deal with it empirically and look at the experiences from, I mean, you can go across so many different, axes. It's incredible. But, Black men tend to find themselves in very precarious situations far more than other demographics, even within the Black community. And when you try to communicate that, it's dismissed as oppression Olympics or something of that nature, trying to
yeah.
get one up on Black women, when in
Hmm.
actuality, it's a response to at least 40 years of absence from the dialogue. The only time Black men are really mentioned is when you talk about incarceration. But short of that, it's kind of the attitude is, well, we already know that stuff about Black men. There's really nothing new. And this is something that I hear in academic circles. I attend Black Studies conferences, Africana Studies
Hmm.
conferences, and the prevailing idea is that we already know enough about Black men. There's really nothing else to discuss. We need to talk about other demographics because there's nothing new with Black men. And I've talked about this before. I even saw one professor get up and she gave a lecture on how there's nothing new to learn about Black men that we haven't already covered in Boys in the Hood, the film from the
Wow.
early 90s. And so she said,
Yikes.
we don't need to do anything. Just show boys in the hood, and we've dealt enough with black male issues. And I'm like, that's pre-internet, like real, like there's nothing, but you might be convinced of that if you just listen to these kind of feminist circles.
Yikes. Yikes. Oh gosh. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. I gotta see at least 109 likes right now. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting. Also, feel free to share it. We're talking about Black masculinity and how Black women in particular interact with Black masculinity. Also, special shout out to those of you who sent in a super chat. I see Miss Delta Guy, as a Black male growing up with a great single mother, I had how to learn how to embrace my leadership and masculine frame. That, that makes sense. There are a lot of men now, if they do grow up in a single household, it's like they're having to find other resources to help define their masculinity, because I'm a firm believer that it takes a man to teach, it takes a man to raise up a man. As a woman, you don't have what it takes to truly understand a male's experiences. At least that's that's my thought on it.
Mm-hmm.
I see Ramesses 7. He says, Doc, is it true you have lots of white women in your class to learn about Black men to be with Black men? I
Oh
have
wow.
heard that.
Yeah, that comes from a discussion that I've been having the last few years. So I teach. I do have one black male oriented class every year, and I'm about to teach in the spring. And in that class, when I first started it over a decade ago, it was primarily Black women that took the course, and that was mainly because coming out of graduate school, I was trained as a feminist. So they would come in the class for me to finger wag at Black men. And I noticed over the next couple of years, I had fewer and fewer Black males take my class, and I had more and more Black women. And when I actually started to change, because let me just frame it this way. The very first day I taught my Black male studies class, the first year, first day, walking up to the classroom, there were two people waiting outside my door. There was a police officer and a military recruiter.
Yikes.
I hadn't even opened the door to see who was in my class yet. And I already had a police officer and a military recruiter. And the police officer was there because he wanted me to identify a student in the room that he suspected was part of a robbery that he wanted me to point out, right? So he could arrest him in class on the first day, right?
Wow, no.
A military recruiter, he wanted to come the first day to recruit. So understand this. He wanted to take Black males out of college and have them go to the military. And he had the nerve to come with a Black male who was lower ranked. And I managed, in all of the conversations that were happening, I managed to pull the brother over who came with him. And I asked him, I said, well, really, how are y'all treated in there as far as rank, as far as whatever? And he just looked at me like, in other words, don't help him. He's like, just don't help him.
Dang, that's crazy. I mean, it's just blatant. It's just blatant at that point.
So that's the first day. And then from there, I'm coming in as a male feminist who's trying to teach gender the only way I've learned how to, which I didn't even realize in many ways how denigrating it was. And so I started to see fewer men take the class. And then when I began to shift my position and actually foreground Black male voices, I noticed fewer Black women would take the class, far more Black males. And then I started to notice Caucasian women coming in. And, it kind of confused me, and I pulled one aside at one point. You had to be very, political. You had to be very, diplomatic, because But when I finally got her talking, she was like, "Well, yeah, I have a Black boyfriend. He's on the basketball team, and I wanted to understand Black culture. I wanted to understand Black manhood." So she didn't need the class for anything other than to learn about him. Now, I'd say in the last 3 to 4 years, that population has shifted. And now it's far more Latinas coming in, fewer white women, and the Latinas are in the class for the same kinds of reasons. And I'm in Fresno, so the Black Latino connection is a little more prevalent here than it might be in other areas.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but they're still coming in to learn about Black men. So yeah, it's definitely happening.
Oh man, that's wild. I see Miss Delta Guy again with the super chat. It says, yes, YouTube and social media are the digital barbershop of today, where Black men can chat, vent, share, and support each other. Facts. Again, another super chat. Miss Delta Guy, I say, as a Black man, if you prick us, do we not bleed? We have feelings, hopes, and dreams too. Facts. Black men are human. Like, this is not. I will tell you. Actually posted this on my community tab earlier today. Ever since it's like it's. I mean, I don't even want to. I don't even try to create these like divisive terms like, oh, I'm a ally for Black men or I'm anti-Black women. It's like it's not that. It's just like I'm a person that believes in trying to have common sense and decency and respect for human beings. And I think Black men are humans, just like I think Black women are humans, just like I think Asian men are humans. Like, you know what I mean? People are humans. And so you know, many of my followers know right now I'm running a campaign. We're trying to run a campaign, Black Men Built That, where I'm trying to go against this narrative that Black men have never really done anything, that they've not built, that they've not participated in society or helped build society, that they're not, you know, like it's just all this negative stuff. And I started hearing it, and I'm like, hey, I think as a woman, as an African American woman, and as one who desires to have kids and sons maybe one day, it's like, we need to actually have a conversation about some of the positive things that Black men are doing that continue to be overlooked. And so I kind of started that campaign, and I'm still doing it right now, in hopes of getting enough support so we can start creating content and videos that also, you know, gets that message out there that like, hey, they're not all dusties, not all horrible, they're not all like just sitting around and not doing anything. They've made incredible contributions. But with that, I've gotten a lot of hate. I got, like I said, a message earlier today where it was just violent. She's calling me all kinds of names, telling me to just hurt myself. It was just like, whoa, where are you coming from? Just because I am acknowledging the fact that, hey, here's a particular people, like within our people group, but men in particular have unique issues and unique traumas and struggles that we need to address and that have impacted the overall community. Like, now I'm some mammy pick me mule, like, make that make sense. I don't get it.
You're not going with you're not going with the narrative. I mean, at the end of the day, Black men are not to be seen as really more than your subjects in many respects. So, in other words, what we were told in the '80s is that to be a good Black man, you had to make six figures. You needed to have a six pack. You need to be over 6'2".
Yeah.
You need to go out and conquer the world. You need to be able to navigate the streets as well as the boardroom. You need to be able to do all of that, but not necessarily to qualify for a woman, but to qualify for an interview for a woman, right? And women weren't really told they had to do anything for a Black man. If anything, he was sort of a guarantee because you were already spectacular, right? He was an inevitability in some resort. So men had to build themselves up to be something, but women already. I mean, what really the kind of legacy of where this Black man, the Black girl magic idea kind of comes out of is the fantastic nature of Black women as it is, whereas men have to build themselves up to qualify. And as long as you have that dynamic in place, there's an air of superiority. There's an air of really, you know, a sort of superiority in place where he has to, you know, really reach the levels you tell him to reach, and you may or may not, you know. I you know, this is, well, I won't go there. I'm say that for another time. I'm gonna go somewhere that probably wouldn't. But, you know, that being said, if you have this kind of space where women don't have to do anything and men have to build themselves up to be worthy of women, it's not surprising when you see this kind of dynamic of female superiority, especially if family after family is female headed, females are making decisions, men are only brought in temporarily to help with reproduction, maybe a little resource, then pushed out and still pulled for resources via family court, but they're not physically present in the same kind of way. So as long as you have that dynamic in place, you're going to have a female superiority framework. So then when someone like yourself comes up and says, well, maybe men aren't all of these bad things, you're going to be attacked by other women because that's not the culture anymore. You don't laud Black men. If anything, you make them serve. You expect them to serve, and you know, they fall off the, as Kevin calls it, the good man tree when, you know, when they're available and you're just worthy of them, and that's the end of the discussion. It's really this kind of strange dynamic. And so when men start looking for women from other places, that's also met with negativity. You know, this is an anecdote I share a lot, but you know, I was married for about 9 years, in a relationship for 11. And after my wife passed, when I was single again in my mid 30s, and I started, kind of looking at a number of my friends, I'm talking about at least 30 college educated, graduated with degreed Black men. Only one was with an African American woman. Only
Mm.
one was with a Caucasian woman. Two had completely opted out. They went what we call monk, but there was no name for it.
Mm.
They just stopped dealing with women altogether because they'd gone through the divorce mill and they were just done. All the
Mm.
rest of my friends and associates had found women from other countries and other cultures. And the majority of those women were Black women from other countries and other cultures. And this is actually backed up with the data from the text dataclysms. If you look at that, where they assess attraction, you'll find that Black men actually, find Black women. I mean, how do I put it? They find white women attractive to the least degree. So, in other
Mhm.
words, when they
Yeah.
had the choice, they went out and found Black women from other countries. But what they were trying to address was the behavior, which again has been shaped by policy in such a manner where they were considered less than. I call them conky serfs. That's what we're expected to serve as. And the men were
Interesting.
just tired of it. So they just, they broke camp and went another way. And so what we're seeing in the manosphere is really, they're really philosophies and ideas that are being named that have been in practice for a while. I mean, I know brothers who are hardcore Black nationalists, activists, scholars, pro-Black to the core, but they go find African women, Caribbean women, and when you sit them down, put a drink in them, and get them to talk, they'll tell you the same nightmare stories that many different men can recount about their upbringing and their relationships with women and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, the prevailing idea is that they're less than, and that's something that these men are trying to respond to. And they've tried
Mm.
dialogue, they've tried argument, they've tried a number of different avenues to get it across that we should actually be able to work together, so on and so forth. But men's behavior, there can be demands placed on that. Women's behavior in our community, not so much. So
Man, yeah, you hit on so much there. And, I think, growing up, I never really saw, like the black girl magic, the queen, all that kind of different stuff. I didn't
mhm,
necessarily see it as detrimental. I just thought, okay, look, black people have a rough out here. So we're just trying to find ways to work on our self-esteem. I mean, the whole queen thing, like I never really fully got because I'm like, there are real responsibilities associated with being a queen. So I'm not gonna
mhm,
just go around calling myself that, knowing that, like, do you even know what that means? But I guess at the time I didn't really see that as a way of kind of creating this separation. But it's like, to your point, we don't see black boy magic, we don't see black men rock, or just like things like that, where we're seeing those things be equally celebrated.
mhm. And
And mhm.
you don't see them on television channels that are fixated
No.
on Black male attention, right? So the few
Mhm.
Black channels we have are, BET and TV1. They're targeted toward Black women. And so when you see these kind of ceremonies and celebrations that do highlight Black girl magic, they're corporate funded. You don't find that for Black males. From
Not at all.
1976 to
Not even.
2018, Black men literally have half the degrees Black women do. So
Mhm.
when you look at K through 12 education, you look at the performance, you look at the everything from the disciplinary rates to those who are being kicked out of school altogether. When you look at the graduation rates, you look at the college
Mhm.
entrance rates, you're not seeing Black boys prioritized. We know that up through eighth grade, only 10% of Black boys are literate, 12% are functional in math and science. There are no major programs that are highlighted and funded to target Black boys. They obviously aren't going to college in the same kinds of ways. They're not transitioning into white collar labor in the same kinds
Yeah.
of ways.
Yeah.
So they're not celebrated in those kind of ways. They're not identified for philanthropic opportunities, so on and so forth. So the kind of celebration is really in many ways buoyed by policy, by practices
Mm.
that primarily target girls. So, for the most part, where you can see the difference is if you've worked in education. And I've taught elementary, middle school, high school, and
Mhm.
college. And when you
Okay.
see it
Wow.
kind
You've
of
been
go
the whole
through,
gamut.
yeah, it's you see it from the very bottom. I mean, even preschool, having my son in preschool, I saw the ways that teachers as young as, dealing with boys as young as 4 would find ways to punish them for the same kind of things all the kids would be doing, but black males would get the overarching amount of
Yeah.
attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, these things have impact. And we haven't even gotten to, the percentage of them put into special ed at a young age and tracked away from college, and really having that having nothing to do with intelligence, but having more to do with what they're labeled as, in terms of behavior. So these kind of
Yeah.
things have lasting, lifelong impact for many black men.
Mm. That's so deep. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. I want to see at least 125 likes, y'all. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting. Also, appreciate the super chats. I see Miss Delta Guy with the file on super chat says black men are tired of fighting 2 wars on 2 fronts: the world and black women. Monk mode.
Mm.
Ooh, that's powerful. And then I
Mhm.
see Lucky Marie. See, black masculinity is attacked by women and LGBTQ, in my opinion. Love the topic.
Yeah, that's actually very predictable in many ways, because a lot of this started with white feminism, right? And the
Mm,
importance of white feminism is not just that white women are doing it, but what white women bring with them, and that is resources. So when you look at the 60s and the 70s, white women made themselves a minority. And so when you start to talk about affirmative action, they actually were able to get affirmative action resources once they designated themselves as a minority. And once you
right,
started to kind of see this push for feminism, it was predicated on a so-called war with white men, right? The idea that being that white men oppress them and therefore
fair.
they need support. Well, if that became the governing paradigm. And so in order for you to benefit from that same thing, you had to be able to demonstrate the same kind of lifestyle, same type of life experience. So what you started to see is more and more black women, and this is what we, that color purple syndrome,
Yeah.
framing the discussion around the oppression by black men because it mirrored what white women were doing, and it allowed you to access
The same thing.
resources that came with white men. So if you could get on white women's coattails, you could actually benefit, and they did in many of the
Mm,
same kinds of ways, even though empirically, when you look at the rates of abuse, I mean, the black community has been primarily bi-directional in terms of abuse for the longest. I mean, the
oh yeah.
rates are
Oh yeah.
really equal either way. And there were periods of time where the abuse were coming from black women in higher numbers than from black men, right? But that that kind of information is not useful or relevant if you're trying to mimic and identify with white women in order to secure the types of opportunities and support and resources that white women were actually getting. So that's how a lot of that came to be. So even now, in terms of the popular feminist tropes, and LGBTs did this too. They aligned themselves with feminists and they started to share the same narrative. So there wasn't as much discussion, for example, if you were LGBT, to talk about black women being dismissive or of your sexuality or being oppressive. There wasn't as much to be garnered there. There wasn't as much equity, if you will, in those discussions. You had to point at heterosexual black men, even if they were in prison, even if they weren't present, even if they
Blame
weren't
black
even
men.
involved. There was more to be gotten from pointing out heterosexual black men as the problem, the way feminists did, because that's where the money was. And you couldn't get access to those resources unless you could mimic the paradigm that white women identified as what was considered, a feminist experience, a woman's experience. And so that's how you have those dynamics. And that's why it's so popular to this day, that if you want to identify yourself as some type of oppressed group in the black community, it's very easy to point at heterosexual black men in order to align
Yeah.
yourself with a particular experience.
I've always found that a little bit contradictory, because it's like, and I talked to my husband about this, right? Where it's like, even when we think of black femininity, and how
Mhm.
sometimes what I see positioned as black femininity, from my understanding, is just, basically white women with blackface on. You know what I mean? It's literally like we're taking white or European culture and then we're trying to just paint black on it and say, oh, this is black femininity. And
Mhm.
it kind of sounds like that is very much what happened when it came to feminism. We almost adopted the inherent issues that, white men and white women had. We adopted it as our own, and then
Mhm.
assumed that the dynamics were the same, where it's like there's absolutely no way the dynamics could have been the same, because one, we come from a totally different cultural vantage point. Two, when have black men ever been and systematically in power like that in America. That's never happened. They haven't had the power to oppress people or power to oppress women. So it's like the whole I've always kind of found it interesting. Now, I mean, I understand, women wanting to be protected. I mean, this nation obviously is misogynist, just, in certain extent, certainly misandrous, but it's like, okay, the way you talk about that and the way that you address that, I think, has become so misconstrued and it's been misapplied, that it's created a lot of unnecessary division in my, in my humble opinion.
Let's bookend it, not with academic papers, but with easily accessible media that all of us have run across, right? So if you take Color Purple from the 80s, and let's take the film Harriet that came out a little while ago, right? Bookend those two films and look at the portrayal of Black men. First of all, if you get to Danny Glover's character, Mr. So we're talking about a character in the early, I mean, just started. But when you look at the time period, ask yourself how many Black men at that time owned their own land, was able to farm, and were essentially wealthy.
Exactly.
What percentage of Black men at the time this film portrays were even in that role? And if there aren't that many, how exactly does Mr. become the face of Black men? And then when you get to Harriet, and they have to fabricate a historical figure that did not exist, a Black man hunting down escaped, enslaved Black folk, right? In the interest of getting white prostitutes, he would have been lynched for saying it. But if you look at both of those films, they, both of which relying a great deal on Black feminist tropes, both men were fabricated entities that did not exist. They either didn't exist at all, or the numbers were so small they were infinitesimal. How exactly does this become the face of Black men, the predominant face? Well, it goes back to what I said about resources. If you don't have a Black male, a heterosexual Black male boogeyman, you can't identify and thus qualify for, the kind of resources that feminism offers. So you have to go
Black men. That's literally blame. I actually have a video talking about that where I was like, why does it seem that no matter where I turn, the answer is always blame Black men? At least within certain contexts, it's like, okay, the easy answer is just blame Black men. That's just no. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just that's just like default. And I didn't really understand it, but what you just said, I'm like, oh, it makes so much sense. There's monetary incentive and there's proven history to show that when you attack heterosexuality and different things like that, then that is a way for you to get institutional support. Never thought of it that way.
Think about it in the academy or in media. Like in the academy, you can get tenure, you can get higher level positions, you can get publications. If you write a book on Black men abusing Black women, it's almost guaranteed to be published as long as it's written, with an adequate level of intellectual rigor. If you write a book about, say, the vulnerability of Black men in terms of intimate partner violence to women, you'd be hard pressed to find a publisher to publish it, not because it doesn't have some credibility to it, but because they're marketing to a predominantly female base. The majority of education is female. You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, if this is an academic text, most publishers will look at it like, we can't sell this, and we don't want to infuriate our base, right? So there's a lot of that happening. And in popular media, I mean, your career can take off if you're willing to tell stories. Like, look at the series Harlem that's out right now. I mean, I've only watched bits and pieces, and I really haven't decided to stomach it yet. But, there are a number of series like this that are from the vantage point of not only Black women, but in many ways, Black lesbian women, and the ideas around how much of a threat Black heterosexual men are. And you can almost get a series out of that. And we could talk about that with a number of shows that popped up and disappeared just in the last year. I did a few shows on them. Lovecraft County or Country, I forget what. There's a number of these films and television series that pop up and reward misandrous portrayals of Black men and boys, and there's no punishment for it. And
there's money.
Black men aren't even going to take you to court. The Black men aren't even going to take you to court. So it's an easy group to attack. There are very few repercussions, and the reward incentivizes more. So. Yeah.
And I think what Black women don't understand, if we position ourselves as a different group than Black men, we in turn end up hurting ourselves in the long run. Because it's like, while we may like to position ourselves as separate, The reality is the system, while it has treated us certainly differently in maybe giving more access to Black women, things like that, to certain things. At the end of the day, the goal was never for Black people in America as a whole to be able to benefit. We weren't brought here so that we as a people could actually progress. You can have individual success here and there, but it's like I don't think we understand that at a certain point we are just leading to our own demise, and we don't even know it because we're just filled with like propaganda or whatever. So
and what you said was so powerful because the incentives are definitely there for Black women to operate in a certain way, but usually what you find by the time you talk about retirement age, what you actually find is a lot of Black women impoverished. Now, it's not to say that they're wealthy up until retirement age. They just tend to be doing better than Black men when you control for incarceration, right? But once they hit retirement age, a lot of these women are going into retirement broke with virtually nothing. So they've been incentivized, and there's been this idea presented to them that you will do so much better. I mean, look at the comedian Monique. She sat down with Whoopi Goldberg, and Whoopi told her, if you want your career to take off, you got to get rid of that Black husband.
Yep. Yeah, I just saw that not too long ago. I was like, oh my gosh.
And that's crazy. That's the same Faustian bargain that's been given to Black women across the pale. But here's the thing: by the time you reach retirement age, now you don't have enough to retire on your own with. All those promises of corporate advancement or whatever. Some Black women may be able to enjoy that, but not many. Very small percentage. I mean, if you look at the percentages of six-figure earners in the Black community, there's still more Black male six-figure earners than Black female, even though Black men experience all these other things that Black women don't. So that being said, the numbers of those who are actually able to tap into that reward the way it's promised is very low. And so a lot of those women, there's been recent articles in the last 2 years coming out about this. Women who are burying their parents or being forced to care for their parents alone. They're losing those high-powered jobs, not able to compete with younger Black women coming in with degrees, even though she may have had 20 years in this field. She can't compete with how much a younger woman with the same degrees will the kind of pay she's willing to take versus her. So you're seeing this dynamic play out where the incentives and the rewards actually don't lead to anything by the time you get to retirement age. And you and I both know Black men have the lowest life expectancy. So when you're talking about women, you're still going into your 70s and 80s. And if you're retiring in your 50s or low 60s, that's a couple of decades of trying to figure out how to live. And I try to tell my students what a 401k is. Once it pays out, you're done.
You're done.
So where do you go?
That's crazy. So you're saying Black men when they retire are basically Black men when they retire are financially better off than Black women as a whole. I mean, I know Black men, even though they don't have as much as education, men across the board make more money than women. That's across all different ethnic groups.
And it includes Black men from 18 to 65. They do earn more for those that are employed. Keep that in mind. But when you control for incarceration, Black men are the only group of men that make less, because incarceration was never supposed to impact any group large enough to have an impact on income or so on and so forth. But it does for Black men. So it kind of depends on how you're looking at it. Black men are doing better for those employed, and for those, who've been incarcerated, it brings down the whole population in terms of earnings. But I'm saying the reason I bring up retirement age is not to suggest that Black men are just doing so much better in terms of retirement, but to suggest that Black women have been offered incentives to go without men, material incentives that don't pay out by retirement age. You know what I mean?
Facts.
That's all I was really going with that.
Man, you were dropping so much heat. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. I want to see at least 149 likes. No, 154 actually now. Shout out to Danica. Thank you for stopping by. Always a pleasure to have you here. I see love your hair shade, just stopping in to show some love. Appreciate y'all. Again, tag anybody on this.
I watch her stuff.
Yeah, no, she has great content, and I love her stuff. Also, feel free to share this with anybody who you think may find it interesting. We're talking about Black masculinity, and specifically how Black women are taught and trained to interact with Black men and Black masculinity. Dr. Hasan Johnson has been just dropping so much so much heat, so much information. I've been learning a lot, y'all, and this has been fire. So, like I said, continue to get those likes up. And I want to move on to the next question. So you touched a lot upon feminism, and really it sounds like it's racist legacy, right? How
Mhm.
it started with white women going, basically just beefing with their men, for lack of a better term. And black women took that model and tried to apply it to also get resources from the government so that they would essentially not need men. I just
Mhm.
want to make sure I'm understanding.
Well, it goes deeper. I mean, again, if you go look, and Tommy J. Curry is really the best place to start with this. If you go look at some of his papers just from the last year alone, some of his
Okay.
work has really been outstanding. Well, it's always outstanding, but it's been really hitting the point. And one of the things he talks about is the way in which white women have secured that position, where he's saying this is not the rise of matriarchy in many respects. It's the next stage of white patriarchy, because white
Huh.
patriarchy has been shaped around pedestalizing white women in a particular way. So you had white female theorists who had kind of framed this idea of how to make men work in their interests. And one of the things that they've been really powerful at is using shaming tactics, other kinds of, but this narrative around protecting white womanhood and prioritizing it in the same kind of way. Now, the black
Mm.
community had a different formation in the United States, right? For the most part, the majority of black women don't even make it to North America until the early 1800s, really about 50 or 60 years before the end of the Civil War. So you have a couple of centuries of mostly black men being brought here and being killed, just working to death. And then it really at a time period in the early 1800s where they needed to actually produce their own enslaved population rather than getting them from Africa because it became illegal. They brought over a number of these women. So you have black men and black women from different parts of the continent being brought over at different periods of time in different
Yeah.
numbers that are suddenly jammed together and called a people. And then you have the incentives of white womanhood, where they're laying out this idea that somehow womanhood has a power in patriarchy that we need to, we need to talk about. And this is white women initiating that conversation. And this offers somewhat, some opportunities to black women. I mean, if you think about the plantation dynamic, at the end of the day, there's a dynamic there that we can't escape. That's fairly natural. You have white men that are sexually exploiting black women, true, but there's still a relationship there of sorts, and you have evidence of white men, who are giving gifts, giving opportunities, giving little things to black women because of the nature of that dynamic. Black men and white women don't have that dynamic. There's clearly sex going on, but in many ways, black men were raped on plantations at the threat of violence, proxy violence, right? The
Yeah.
threat of being lynched if she so much as said you looked at her sideways. So, and even if you did have some kind of relationship on a plantation, she couldn't gift you with anything. You couldn't, your status couldn't be improved because the woman of the plantation. No, that was not the dynamic. Especially after formal slavery ends, you have the offspring of these dynamics between white men and black women that are able to get some type of, depending on the situation, sometimes some types of opportunities, some types of resources afterwards because of their direct connection to white men. You don't have that with black men and white women in the same kind of way. So these dynamics create very different qualities of life over centuries for black men and black women. We play different
Mhm.
roles in society. And that being said, it kind of cements those differences over time. And by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, where you have a new wave of gendered opportunities being levied at the community, there is a
Man,
definite split that takes place.
man, that's crazy. Man, that's a mouthful. That's a mouthful. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up and tag anybody on this discussion or share with anybody who you think may find it interesting. Like I said, we are just, man, there's just so much wealth of knowledge being dropped right now. So let's move on to the next question.
Mhm.
Um, so then, I mean, and I think you've really touched upon this, but I don't know if you have anything else that you would want to cover off specifically. But would you say that institutional racism is inherently misandrist?
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, I think Dr. Curry's work, I think Jim Sedanius's work definitely speaks to this. Even R.W. Connell's work, they definitely speak to the assault on black men as the primary target in regard to what we identify as racism. And part of that assault, in my assessment, is the somewhat prioritizing of Black women in regard to policy. That's another form of assault, right? That does not allow the family to function in ways that we identify as healthy, right? Where a man can make a
Mm.
contribution to the family dynamic that is reputable of sorts. So that being said, if she can get resources on par with what you have to spend your life working for, what does that do to the family dynamic? I mean, shout out to one of my colleagues, BGS Ibmore. He dropped a video a couple
Mm.
months ago on the welfare cliff. Basically, what he
Mm.
pointed out is women who are making in the low 30s were getting up to $65,000 in resources in terms of quality of life for making that amount. Whereas, Black men, if you want $65,000 worth of income, you have to
Yeah,
go
work
make
for that.
65,000.
Yeah, work for
So,
that.
so you have men competing with women's network, not only in terms of what's coming from the state or what's coming from a college degree, but also what's
Mm.
coming from her network. In order for you to be a viable candidate to be with her, you have to be able to compete with her entire network. And that being said, that leaves a lot of Black men unable to compete. And couplings can still happen despite that, but men are not necessarily respected along those lines if they're not able to compete with her network. So you have a very different kind of relationship that tends to form that seems to be rooted in damn near an almost visceral hatred. And that's one of the things Black men will reach out and talk to me about. Like, and I'll have them from 17 years old to 60, and they'll be writing me, why does this woman hate my guts? I mean, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. I'm trying to do everything she's asked of me, and it's never enough. When we get into it, one of the things we find is that especially if he's not able to keep up with her network, and see,
Oh yeah.
you know,
And that makes sense. You're saying it's like, so Black men are fighting against really the institutional benefits that Black women have as far as just governmental support, different, maybe different opportunities in work, different opportunities low, just
sure.
scholarships, things like that, that many Black men don't have access to. And so
Mhm.
now you take that, and of course that's going to create an imbalance where you have these women that, whether it's they have more education or they have
Mhm.
more opportunities to create more money, they're not going to go around and now respect men who are from monetary perspective or whatever not on their level. That's just
Well,
arguably the nature of women. Period, is that they want men
mhm.
that they feel like can protect and provide for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would ask you in terms of the networks of, Black women that you've seen over the decades, if you are a woman that chooses to be with a man that earns about 25,000 a year, but you love him to death, how is that relationship received in those networks?
It's
In
not.
general.
It's not.
Yeah,
It's
it's
like it's
not.
not received. It's like that's something that you do behind closed doors if he looks good, but you're not.
Mhm. Right.
No.
Right.
Like
Whereas if I'm a six-figure earner and I decide to be with a waitress, nobody cares. I mean,
nobody cares. No, you're
if she's a millionaire, or she's a waitress, nobody cares about her. But it comes down to him. His earnings somehow reflect his value overall, and that's the dynamic that we've been grappling with. And it's only been in recent years that men have had a public stage to actually dialogue with one another about how to respond to that. Right? Some of it is very controversial, but it is what it is.
so this is interesting because with that, you mentioned earlier that if Black men who are working, who are employed, are making generally more than the Black women, but when you control for incarceration rate, right, and those men who are locked up who aren't able to make any money, that brings the overall earnings of Black men comparative to Black women down and below them. I just want to make sure I understood that
Yeah.
correctly
And
because I
it's
think
it's
that's
yeah, and it's not just that it brings the wages down. Those men are underemployed, meaning they are still working, but they're receiving pennies on the dollar for their labor. So that
right.
that that what that those resources bring in actually drag down Black male numbers. But and then of course by the time you get out of prison, it's like you have a scarlet letter on. I mean, nobody
Good
wants to
luck.
hire
Yeah.
you. You can't even get housing if you have a housing voucher. Nobody will rent to you. And this, of course, was exacerbated by the pandemic. So one of the things we've been hearing is that the pandemic is being equated to a she session because on
Mm.
paper we can see the loss of jobs for women, we can see the loss of income for women. But what happens when you're dealing with populations of Black men who are either underemployed or unemployed before the pandemic? Obviously, those men don't benefit. They don't
No, of
advance
course
during the pandemic. They go even lower, but they're not on the docket at all. So when you have a she session, you have to actually ask people to imagine what's happening to those Black men that weren't even part of the recorded discussion before the pandemic. They go even lower.
Ooh, yeah, no, that is facts. And I guess I mean, just what you're saying, it's starting to click because I guess and I'm sure you're familiar with Kevin Samuels, where he's kind of talked about, okay, Black men are doing okay, right? They are, what is it like? Majority of them, I think it's like over 50% are middle class, and then 54% of them are single and childless. So it's like Black men are doing okay, institutionally, right? Why aren't you guys marrying them? And then shout out to Omawale Africa. I know I've kind of listened to his content, and he's kind of questioned that notion that, hey, Black men as a whole are doing good. They're all middle class. They're financially okay. They're financially stable. Just look
Mhm.
around you. And so I've kind of heard, from what I understand, I could be correct, but from what I understand, somewhat of a competing narrative, one that says Black men as a whole are doing good. We're just lying about them. And then others are saying, no, they're not doing good. And there's institutional reasons.
Mhm.
And it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're more saying, hey, for those who are working and are able to work, they are able to succeed in many cases, and they are able to gain more than the women. But for those who find themselves locked up in the system, right? The benefits or the repercussions are dire. They
Well,
are dire.
we know roughly 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated in their lifetime. 1 in 10 are roughly incarcerated at a time, at least up to last year. We still haven't seen how exactly the pandemic impacts a lot of this, so I'm still
Wild.
waiting for that data. But for the
Wild.
most part, you have 1 in 10 incarcerated at a given time. But if you look at the BLS data again for men that are employed, they are doing better from age 18 to 65 than Black women. So that said, what people miss with Kevin is Kevin does make those kind of statements in general, but he's ultimately his platform is dedicated to a very elite group of men. And the reason
Fair.
he's doing that
Fair.
is because those are the groups that women have identified that they want. So I don't care if you're talking about women who are waitresses or they work at 7-Eleven, or you're talking about women who are millionaire earners, all of them, for the most part, are and he pulls this out of his show. He asks them what percentage of the household income do you want to be responsible for if you marry? And the overwhelming majority of them say none or very
None.
little. Right. So
None.
and when you get them to talk about the quality of life they want to live, almost in every state you point to, they're essentially identifying a 6-figure earner at the least, in terms of the lifestyle many of them want. And much of this, again, has been mitigated by media. So we have
Of
these
course.
fantastical ideas. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the projects I have my students do is for every television show they watch, examine and characterize and go price the housing that you see the characters live in. I don't care if it's a movie or a TV show. Go see if you can find the price of a similar, and what you often find is they have these fantastical qualities of life that we're being sold
Yep.
as average. That loft in the middle of the city that overlooks the entire city, right? That this character whose income you can't even determine somehow just lives in, right? These kind of ideas shape our imagination. So when you start to say, start to ask women, well, what is it you want? Inevitably, whether they're cognizant of it or not, they're identifying a very wealthy population, which is a very small group. I mean, I usually tell women, y'all are competing for the same 2 dudes in every city.
Quite quite
This is essentially
literally.
what you're doing. The
And
same
then
two dudes.
it's
Yeah.
competing, but also not wanting to compete because women are the prize and therefore shouldn't have to do anything but just
Yes.
show up. And
Yes.
it's like, and then that creates a whole other just
Yeah.
toxic dynamic. And I'm like, and I think about this, I'm like, at what time in America, as
Mhm.
Black people, period, has there not been some level of struggle? So
Oh
I'm like,
no,
I don't
there's
understand how we grew up in a generation where now there's this expectation that things are just supposed to be easy. You're not supposed to do anything. I'm like, do you not know history? Do you not understand what your mother and your grandmother and your great great grandmother went through in this
Mhm.
time?
But that's
So
but that's but that speaks to how recent it is. I mean, I
fair,
use the example with
fair.
mine, but with yours, did you ever hear your grandmother say he needs to make 6 figures to be worth my time?
That no, are you kidding? No, she was not. She was, I mean, a sharecropper, hard worker. I mean, I'm thinking both of them. Like that just was
Exactly.
not. It was not a thought. That's not how they thought. It was
Right.
just different.
Right. So we're talking about something that happened only in the last few decades in terms of the
Fair.
shift in expectation. So Kevin's platform is framed around that because that's what women have been identifying at least for the last 40 years, that they want. And that's what he's speaking to. But he does have an overall point to suggest that Black men are not doing as bad as people think. And between him and Omawali, they're both right and they're both wrong about different things, right? Because at the end of the day, Black men are doing better than and worse than Black women at the same time. And if they're doing better and worse than Black women, then you can see how they're doing in relation to other groups. And this is the kind of dynamic we're looking at. So again, when you leave incarceration off the table, there's a subset of employed men that are competing in society. And if you add incarceration, that same group of a larger group of Black men are doing worse than. It's very much a mixed bag in some respects. But what I think Kevin is trying to say is, all right, and he's done this many a time. He's saying, okay, if you don't qualify for what these elite men want, then the men you need to be looking for are actually around here. And can you actually see them in your day-to-day life? Do you even have the lenses on to where those men become visible to you? Because there are more of them than any other group. But if you don't have a respect for Black men in general and your standard is so elite, those men aren't going to come. They're not going to show up on your radar, even if they're sitting right next to you at work.
Oh, that's fast.
Or you might actually get into relationships with those men while the whole time you're still waiting for Prince Charming, you know what I mean, to come in. So you're dating men and maybe even marrying and having children with men that you're fundamentally waiting to replace once the ideal comes along who's able to meet your standard. And there's been a lot of those phone calls coming in the Kevin show at the same time too. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I've spoken to a few women about that who, he is very controversial, especially among us Black women. And, you have some who hate him. I generally find the two women who hate him, right? Or there are women who are just like, they love him, appreciate him. It's very rare that I find somebody who's just kind of like neutral. Very, very, very rare. But I will say, while there's things that I may not agree, I think sometimes his tone can be a little aggressive or may not be as kind. I understand at the end of the day that he's a businessman and that he has a brand and that he needs to have an entertaining show. So I take that into consideration when I think about how he's talking to these women. And I also know it's like anytime you start the situation with the top of the top of the top, you can't be upset when there are standards that seem unrealistic. Because it's like the whole premise, the whole foundation of the conversation is that this is something that only a small percentage of people gain or earn. So to me, I'm like, oftentimes I hear him say as far as standards, I'm like, no, this is reasonable for somebody who already wants the top 10%, already wants the top 5%. This is what they're looking for. Why are you complaining? Like, this is what you want to hear this, right? So
no, there's a type of level setting that's going on, and Kevin has become the face of it. But going back to what I was saying earlier, if men have to qualify in the Black community, right? We have to qualify to be worthy of female attention, but women only have to exist. One of the things that we've done in the Black community is we've almost tried to make eggs the value of diamonds. That's essentially, in a very rough way of putting it. We just decided one day that eggs should be as valuable as diamonds, and diamonds just need to be as valuable as eggs. Now, you can come up with that yourself and you can try and act it out, but you can't make the environment conform to your wishes. So again, if everybody is arguing and trying to chase the same two guys in every city, you can't pretend that they're not valuable, and you can't somehow make all women more valuable simply because you want it to be the case. It doesn't work like that. Now, we don't like to monetize our value in society, but the reality is Black men's value has been monetized, since the beginning. But even within the community, it's been monetized for generations. And in the 80s onward, it's been crystallized in a very powerful way that, and Black boys are taught this. You have no value unless you can bring. How can I put this? I myself have run into women that have expected me to buy them $900,000 $1 million homes simply because she deserves it. And literally, this will be someone that I met 3 weeks ago.
Right.
I've never heard of a guy saying, well, you need to buy me a $900,000 house in order for me to be you. That's not the way our standards and frameworks.
No, it's not reality.
Right. Yeah. So
that's to me. And I actually did a video on this, and I got he had some people who were butthurt, but I'm like, at the end of the day, I don't. You don't just deserve luxury just because you're born. Like, you work for it. If you want luxury, that's okay. If you
Mhm.
desire it, cool. But nobody just deserves to have a silver spoon in their mouth. I'm like, what planet do you live on to think that that's just okay? That, like, oh, I'm a goddess queen, therefore I deserve a man that makes seven figures, or else he's not on my level. Like, where, huh? Like,
Yeah.
where did that come from?
And literally, goddess queen is the language being used. So much so that Monique had to come out recently to say, look, we got to stop using this language of being queens if we haven't earned it. She actually had to publicly state that because that's how common that language has become. And
We
I'm
don't.
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just thinking, because it's like, if you actually do research, that's actually one of the things I think I want to talk about, to go a little bit more deeply into, like, what does it mean to be a queen? Like, if
Mhm.
you actually understand, so what were queens doing back in Africa, or where our
Right.
ancestors came from? What were the
Mhm.
coronation rights? What were
Mhm.
their responsibilities? You know
Mhm.
what I mean? What did they have to maintain? Like, there was actually code of conduct, there were
Mhm.
ethics, there was an expectation of behavior. It didn't just exist just in some random silo and they could do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we just throw the stuff around, not really understanding that,
Mhm.
hey, there is a heavy weight associated with that term.
Sure.
So that's, like I said earlier, I don't think I ever really fully understood the need for us to be calling queen, when I know that there's so much associated with that term, especially
Yeah.
historically.
Well, and there's a very cherry picked narrative there. Because here's the thing. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm for getting rid of the whole royalty dynamic anyway. But if we're going to use it, if you're a
Right.
queen, if you're a queen, what am I? Right.
Right. You can't have a queen in a dusty that shares your complexion in your
Sure.
DNA.
No,
Don't
I mean,
that make that make sense?
if anything, I'm your king. And see, when we go back to feminism, we don't want to employ that top down dynamic between men and women. So we have queens, and the counterpart in this new popular imagination, the counterpart
Mhm.
to the queen is a warrior drone. Where do I get this from? There's a,
Interesting.
there's a speech. If you can find it on YouTube, actually, it's Dr. Julia Hare. Rest in peace to her. A very powerful scholar. She and her husband Nathan Hare. He founded the first Black Studies department in San Francisco in
Mhm.
1968. But Julia Hare is on Tavis Smiley's. He used to do those annual events where Farrakhan and Cornell West and Julianne Malveaux and all these Black celebrity intellectuals will come together and talk. And
Right.
she, at one point, she was talking about the Queen Mother of the Universe, Black women. And she was talking about the characteristics of the Queen Mother of the Universe. And when she got to men, she talked about men as the warriors, right? And if you just listen to her, and again, all due respect to Dr. Hare, the queen warrior dynamic suggests a power relationship that leaves Black women in a position of superiority. But we know,
Mhm.
if you invoke a queen, usually you invoke a king, and a
Right.
king is
Yeah,
not her
absolutely.
subject. A king is not her subject, but we can't have that dynamic. So you have, and this happens not only with how we imagine the power dynamic of relationships, it also happens in terms of just how we kind of frame the relationship between Black women and men anyway. And it's really
Right.
it's a fairly top down kind of framework. And this is one of the reasons the manosphere has become so frustrating for a lot of people. And even the frustration you're getting for aligning yourself in some relationship to it, being willing to have certain types of
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
The idea being, how can you give these men voice? Because they're not supposed to have it. They're supposed to do what we
Mhm.
say. They're supposed to function in terms of how we've been taught they're supposed to function. They're not supposed to have a thought process unique to themselves. And really, when you look at it, it's somewhat inevitable, because even a lot of the programs that I see coming up are not, they haven't thought about, look, I'm seeing women with sons who are actually going out of their way to build Black Girl Magic programs and go out and get funding. And literally, their sons are sleeping on park benches. And that's not an exaggeration. That is a literal
Whoa.
situation. They're sleeping on park benches. They're strung out. They're dropping out of school. And these women with no daughters are going out to build Black Girl Magic. So that's the dynamic we're getting at, where boys and men just, as Tim Howard, who's actually in your chat, something he said a couple weeks ago. I don't know if he saw the show where I kind of, quoted him at the beginning of it, but he made an interesting statement that to many Black women, the only people that are other women. In other words, men, and Black men in particular, don't even qualify as people in the way they kind of imagine the world. That's a lot of what's going on right now.
Man. Oh man. Like that's again, I'm dumbfounded. I'm like, that's this is so much there. It's so much there. You know, I saw the one apology that I think you did like maybe like last week or two
Oh,
weeks ago.
right.
And you know, it's interesting because you know, I was watching it and I'm like listening to her and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I'm like I am like feeling their emotions. I'm like, oh man, this is like tear joking. And then I start going to the comments and I see a
Right.
totally different response. And
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, I was like kind of shocked. And I
Hmm.
told my husband, and he's like, "Oh no," he's like, "That's that's what's to be expected." Because he's like, many of these, most you know, right now, just the relationship is so broken that it's like say somebody I don't know, God forbid, abuses you 100 times over, and then they you know write you a letter and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and you're like, "Well,
Yeah.
you abused me 100 times. This letter isn't going to do anything. How are you going to help me get over my abuse? What are you willing to do to get into my life to help me do better?" And he's like, you know, you have that feeling really
Hmm.
on both sides. But I
Yeah.
saw it, especially in that particular top, I saw how the men were responding to what some called, you know, performative action, fake
Hmm.
tears, different
Hmm.
things like that. And it just showed me, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's just so much to
Yeah.
unpack here. There is so much to
Yeah.
unpack, you
Well,
know?
and then too, she identified herself as a millionaire in a lot of her social media. So one of the questions to be asked is,
Interesting.
okay, if you've had this revelation and you're a millionaire, or what is this just a verbal apology, or
Right.
do
Are you
you have
gonna
to do something?
pay up?
But but alongside that, I posted it and I barely said anything. I just because I really wanted to foreground that and get men's reactions. And aside from the clear, outright response, some people just had F her or whatever. You actually had plenty of brothers who were doing shows where they literally broke down the apology and the fundamental problems with how she went about it. And I think those are the more constructive videos to watch because a lot of the rage and frustration that you see is one thing. But when you actually listen to the rationale behind it, it makes a lot more sense. So, just in a nutshell, I'll just real quick with this. One of the ways she kind of went against her own apology was to kind of switch the conversation to point to yet again what black men are doing wrong. So, and you're a married woman. If you've done something to your husband, maybe he's done something back, maybe he hasn't. But if you're going to apologize to your husband for something you've done, it does not work to say, I'm sorry I did this, honey, but you're responsible for everything. You know what I mean? That does not come across as an apology.
Not even,
What
not
comes across
even
as an apology
slightest.
is, I did X and I apologize. Quiet. Leave that there. And then if you want to go into more detail about what you did and own your part in that, beautiful. But that's not what she did. She had a lot of little digs in there that men were just kind of like. So the first 5 minutes was cool, and then after that, it was just like, hmm, that's and so there were a number of things. So there were a number of shows where they actually broke down the problems in her apology, so where you could see the logic behind why so many men were frustrated with what she had to say. Some of it seemed very self-serving. Some of it, as you said, seemed very present, very performative. But a lot of people actually went in on what she said and how she went about kind of, putting black men in a position where they were responsible for her behavior, her feelings, so on and so forth. That's not how you do an apology. So anyway,
That's interesting. I may have to go check out check out some channels who break it down because like I said, my first thought I didn't even hear the whole thing. I got like halfway through, but I'm like, oh, the emotions, like the heartstrings.
well, she
But
was it was like a half hour long. So yeah, you stay with it for a few more minutes, you'll be like,
and then
hmm,
you're like, ah, that's
hmm.
cute, but
Hey, where you get that from? That's interesting. So yeah, you gotta delve into it. But my question to black men was, and this was something that BGS and a number of others were talking about a couple of years ago. They were saying, when the manosphere was primarily just men and women hadn't really started to come in and ask questions and all kinds of, they were saying, look, women are going to come into the space, especially as the environment dictates, as things become more desperate, as the need for relationships increase. You're going to have more women coming into the space trying to have dialogue. And the question BGS asked is, are you guys ready? And at the time, a lot of men were like, nah, they're not coming in here. And then, that obviously changed, especially during the pandemic. You don't have a Kevin Samuels with over 1 million subscribers without a pandemic.
No,
Pandemic
no, no, no,
changed
no,
the
no, no,
entire
not at all.
dynamic. Yeah.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Eh,
So, but without the pandemic, the idea was that, you really didn't even need to listen to men. There's no need to. They fall off trees. You get them whenever you want.
fall off trees.
Yeah, pandemic forced people to re-examine that, and that's when you started to see all these people, and they would come over to Kevin sometimes with this incredible hostility, but they would still listen every week because you had women who had been listening to relationship gurus and talk show hosts, and none of it worked. So they were finally ready to listen to what men who weren't catering to them had to say, and that doesn't happen without a pandemic. So,
Single, unmarried relationship gurus.
right,
Like,
right.
which hashtag no judgment to anybody who's single or if you're like wanting to get married, but I always find it curious why sometimes women, modern women, black women listen to people who don't have the results that they want. Like, for example, let's say I want to have, I don't know, I want to get a 6-pack. I'm not going to look at somebody who's 700 pounds overweight and say, hey, can you help me get 6-pack? I'm going to go to somebody who's a personal trainer. They have tested and approved their methodology. I see that they have results that I want, and I'm going to listen to you. And I think we have some people over here, they're trying to go on a diet, and they're following people who are obese. And it's like, and then now you don't understand why you're not getting the results you want. Where it's like, what you're listening to hasn't been tested and approved. Go to somebody who actually has the results you want.
Well, it strokes the ego to go to somebody that not only tells you what you want to hear, but tells you that you don't need to do anything. You're already special because you exist, and men still need to qualify themselves to you. Again, we don't want to match any sense of value to what's actually going on in the world. So eggs should be the price of diamonds and vice versa. And yeah, okay, it doesn't work. But now what?
Oh, man.
And this is important for Black men who were never told they had value. Even coming in the 80s, most especially, and I keep foregrounding the 80s because that was an important decade for gender discourse in the Black community. Black men were never taught they had value. So it actually took until this last decade for this concept of sexual marketplace value to actually impact how they kind of started to see things. So now you have this language coming in that suggests that no, you have value, but it generally doesn't come about until you're older. Well, for men who were never told they had value at any point, we were told that you had to, you kind of had to seduce her, you had to pedestalize her, and your value came to based on how much pleasure you brought her, based on how pleased she was with your service, that determined your value. And so even when you get to a point in life where you're entering your 40s and you're earning well, now all of a sudden, the women that never spoke to you are trying to get at you. It still took a lot of men a while to figure out what was going on. So by the time we were introduced to sexual marketplace value, many men were like, oh, so I do have value. And not only do I have it, these women have been showing me I have it, but nobody explained it to me. So you just think that the way you're treated at 17 is the way you're going to be treated. I mean, and you've experienced this from middle school to high school to college. The women that everybody wanted never dated anyone in their grade. The middle school girls were dating high school guys. High school girls were dating college guys. The college women were dating grown men who were doing things out in the world. They weren't, and so men saw this dynamic and we just said, well, damn, we don't have any value. But then all of a sudden something switches. And now all of a sudden you have these young, beautiful women approaching you if you've done fairly well. And you're just like, okay, what's this about?
Right.
But if you've been told you have no value, it's hard to reconcile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. For those of you who are on, please get those likes up. Please get those likes up. Tag anybody on this discussion who you think may find it interesting. Now, Dr. Johnson, I do want to be mindful. I know we we have quite a few more questions to cover off, and I know we're almost a little past an hour and a half. So I just want to check with your time and see how you're doing.
Okay, I just got to go cook my son dinner, so we're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Also, I want to appreciate or thank all of you guys who have sent in some love and super chats. Shout out to Barry Little. I see sharing on my timeline, donating a like, giving a shout out to Dr. Johnson. Support your scholars. I see Miss Delta Guy again. See, let's just say it. Black women are subsidized by the system and state. In exchange, they practice black misandry, Fajan bargain. And then I see another one with Miss Delta Guy. It says black men who make it are doing well, but too many black men are left behind. Facts. And I see another one regarding Kevin Samuels having a tall, well-dressed, groomed black man in a suit was a shock to black people. Agreed. Agreed. I kind of think, that despite his controversy, I think overall his influence has been a net positive because I think he's forcing situations and conversations that I don't know would have happened on such a wide scale otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
I see the Manosphere Warrior drones off program. And then shout out to XY Tech. Subscribing. This convo was worth every penny. Again, Miss Delta Guy, sadly, I've seen black mothers invest in their daughters and ignore their sons. I caught family members. Crazy.
There's been research on that, as a matter of fact.
It's really
where you actually see black boys' performance being rooted very much in their mother's opinions of them. I mean, there's one major paper on this that we've been talking about for a couple of years, but Green Gorilla just did a show about it. I want to say a week or two ago. But basically what you see happening in African-American households is the prioritizing of women's education, girls' education, and the dismissal of boys, even when the boys are doing better than the girls. Because the assumption is not that he be the one to go to college. It's not that he be the one to go into white-collar labor. The assumption is that it's her. And again, this goes back to that gynopathetical family structure I talked about, where the queen she bequeaths the future queen with the rulership, if that makes any sense. And I'm joking around a little bit, but it is kind of that dynamic.
Yeah, it is.
If you have a boy with potential, you don't bequeath upon him kingship. You just, at best you say good job, but the focus is on the girls to set up the next generation of leadership. And it's the same thing going on with electoral politics too. Because that's based in education. So
you said there's paper on this or a book. I'd be interested to check it out.
Yeah, hold on. I'll pull it up and I'll give you the exact name, because I think it's important that people be able to at least go find it. So I have it right here. Bear with me for a quick second. Here it is. Okay. I don't know if you want me to just read the title or share the screen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the title is Mothers, Academic Gender Stereotypes, and Education-Related Beliefs About Sons and Daughters in African-American Families. This is a paper by Dana Wood, Beth Klertz, Costes, Ndidi Okeke, Adianu, Stephanie J. Rowley, and this came out in 2009. And within the abstract, it reads, just a select portion of it, it says, consistent with hypotheses, mothers hold less favorable expectations for sons and perceive sons to be less academically competent than daughters. In addition, mothers reported stereotypes favoring girls over boys in academic domains. Stereotype endorsement, in turn, was related to mothers' educational expectations for and beliefs about the academic competence of their own children, even with youth's actual achievement controlled.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay. And you said mother's academic stereotype
Mother's academic gender stereotypes and education-related beliefs about sons and daughters in African-American families.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So not only, it's the system and the society dismissing boys, even mothers are dismissing boys.
Mothers. Yeah. No, I mean, we've seen that.
Look at it this way. If, about 5 years ago, it was determined that Black women were the most enrolled in higher education, the most enrolled demographic, right? In order to be enrolled in higher education, you generally had to do somewhat well in K through 12. But if Black women were reading at in 8th grade, reading at a 10% level in terms of literacy, you couldn't have that. So the split we're talking about happens much earlier than college. Right?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to the last question, see if I can power through this quickly with you. Okay, so would you say that a Afrocentric or African-centered identity is required to understand the history of Black masculinity?
I don't know if I'd say required. It definitely doesn't hurt, but I tend to lean more for an African. I mean, to me, it's more of a black male identified framework. And the reason I say
Okay.
that is because if you leave out the male component, you still end up, based on the power dynamics in our cultural practice as an African American community, you still end up with a masculinity defined mostly by women and women's interests. And that doesn't necessarily work in the favor of boys and men. So I think that male component needs to be central to that discussion. And that comes, of course, with a male experience, that's added to that. So if the expectation is that I make six figures, but we know, only what less than 9% do, then maybe I have something else to bring to bear on that definition of masculinity in our community.
So so you're saying that you think that it's, while it could help, it's more stronger to focus on male and the way male has been defined within America specifically. I just want to
Well,
make sure.
black men.
Black male. Okay.
Yeah.
Black male. Okay.
Black men.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. Um, okay. Now this kind of feeds into the question a little bit. Can you identify as an American or a Westerner and support the advancement of Black men at the same time?
You kind of can't sidestep it. I mean, again, as black men in North America, we do have a Western experience that needs to be negotiated. I mean, the
Mm,
majority of black folk don't have passports. So as far as actually
fair.
traveling to Africa, there's a very small percentage of people that have regularly been able to do so. We've been brought up in a Western context. We've been subject to a Western economy, a Western culture, and one that many of us have participated in hurting
Yeah.
ourselves about. So
Uh-huh.
you can't excise that from the discussion. You can't. And there's also some realities between our experience here and those on the continent that still needs to be reconciled as well. You cannot separate these things out. It may work on a theoretical level, but when you get to a practical level, it gets much messier, and you can't just eliminate whole categories because it feels good to do so. You got to deal with
That
reality.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. What you're saying, for, let's say you're African American and your family has been here for 6, 7 generations,
Mhm.
right? For you to now all of a sudden say, okay, I've taken a blood test and I identify with people from Guinea-Bissau. That's where I came from. It's like, while that may be true, and you can certainly do your research and maybe try to find
Mhm.
a sense of solace or sense of understanding in your history, you
Mhm.
also can't overlook the fact that there was a particular experience that your family had while they were
Right.
here for 7 generations, like that.
Absolutely.
So
Ab-
I think that makes sense. And I think sometimes when we talk about at least I've heard these conversations we've had, sometimes they're just so simplified, and we
Mhm.
don't really look at the complexities of the Black or the African experience, how it's happened over
Mhm.
decades, generations, and how that
Absolutely.
is so colored.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got to get your hands in the muck of the realities of the history, and it can't remain theoretical or ideological. You have to deal with the realities of the social environment and the way it's been over generations, as you said.
makes so much sense. Shout out to Micah the comedian. I see. Do Black Women Hate Black Men by A.L. Reynolds, chapter 2, page 8.
Yeah.
Looks like I also saw, shout out to Snuggles for the $5 on the super chat. I see. I hope this is not wrong for me to ask, but what are your thoughts on the young man Tommy Sotomayor shining a light on bad behaviors, if you don't mind?
Wait. Oh.
Tommy Sotomayor.
Oh, okay. I thought somebody was saying young men that he was pointing to. I got lost in that. Okay. So let me see what are my thoughts on Tommy Sotomayor
Tommy Sotomayor.
shining a light on
Shining a
bad
light on bad
behavior.
behaviors, if you don't mind.
I'm not sure. Well, I mean, I think most of the behavior he talks about last time I listened to him was black women's. If that's what's being referred to, there's an importance in that because again, in the community, men have not really had that framework, that stage that to operate on. So when we would talk about our experience in relationships or in families, a lot of our experience was left out. So again, I said earlier when you talk about black families, one of the things we've heard since the 70s is that black men were deadbeat dads, right? They
Yep.
just never were there. But no one wanted to actually ask the question if black men were responding to anything, one of the things in my work I've talked about is the silent protest since the 1960s,
Mhm.
where the rates of marriage for men, black men, dropped considerably. But it's in accordance with the rise of family court policy,
Mhm.
of no fault divorce. Men were stepping back because there were very practical reasons for doing so. So, with that, you didn't get that side of the discussion. All you got was men are just deadbeat dads, and not that they may have actually been making a proactive, purposeful step away from something that was actually very problematic for them, or that in terms of this whole deadbeat dad narrative, that at the end of the day there were powers given, right? So if you talk about everything from the pill to no fault divorce, women all of a sudden had a great deal of power that in many ways could be used to chase black men off. As soon as some women, and this was something I talked to one of my subscribers last night about, as soon
Mhm.
as some women had that baby that they had a biological imperative to have,
Mhm.
he became a threat to her running her own household. So if you can put him out and secure child support in one fell swoop, where was the incentive not to do it? And so, again, especially if you start talking about false charges of abuse that
Oh,
recall no evidence, or, and this is something even lawyers have been telling women in divorces, if you claim that he's touched the children in some kind of way, you can
mhm.
actually get custody. These are real practices that men are experiencing that we have no microphone until recently to say
Fair.
anything about. And so women are engaging in this behavior because they're being incentivized to do so. They're given carte blanche
Yep.
power. I mean, even birth control. Women have control over their bodies before, during, and after the sex act. Men have condoms and vasectomies and the pull-out method. You know how unreliable that is. So,
Right. Right.
so that said, there's a lot of power that's been given to women, and in many ways, many men were run off, and yet that's not part of the discourse. The only acceptable discourse is that men are inherently deadbeat fathers. It's
Mm.
a one-way dynamic that produced a lot of problems. So going back to Tommy Sotomayor, to the extent that he's pointing out black women's behavior that goes against what we've been allowed to talk about, that's an important part of the dialogue that men need to have. I don't really follow Tommy Sotomayor outside of that, so I have nothing to really say about him. But in terms of the larger discussion, some of what black men have to say that they've not been allowed to say is not going to be pleasing to the ear. Not.
Fair. Fair. Shout out to Miss Delta Guy for the $5 super chat. It says, I have no problem with black women promoting being strong and independent, but why they need to bash and work against black men? Stop it.
Yeah, I think there's a certain type of strength that's really been fetishized in media.
Mm-hmm.
My son and I sat down and watched a series on Netflix called I think it's damn it, I forgot the name of it. I think it's Arcade. I think that's what it was. But anyway, one of the things we saw is we've been seeing this for years, but just this whole kind of culture of defining women against masculine kind of frameworks, right? The more
Right.
tough, argumentative, competitive,
Mm-hmm.
this idea of womanhood in Western media. She's stronger than the boys. She's smarter than the boys. She's physically dominant. All these kind of things that are being popularly passed off. And now what's acceptable for men is being a follower, being underneath her, serving her interests, and somehow maybe at the end of the story you'll be rewarded with her love and attention. These are the kind of dynamics that boys are being fed. I mean,
Yep.
my son was 13 years old when he told me he had never seen a boy beat a girl at anything in media, from cartoons to movies to television shows. Up to the age of 13, he had never seen a boy outsmart or physically dominate a girl
Mm.
in anything. What exactly are we being programmed to believe?
Wow. Very interesting. Very interesting. I see Ruminant, I think Melanoid, I hope I didn't mess that up. With the $5 super chat. In the midst of her apology, it says the good doctor required us to engage with her on their terms. Okay, so it looks like he's referring to that the earlier conversation. Okay, so on to the next question. So do you think most black female academics oppose black male studies? Why or why not?
Oh yeah, I think the common response we get is that Black studies, the history of Black studies, at least up to the rise of Black feminism, was already Black male studies in their assessment. But
Hmm.
that's kind of like saying that playing with Barbie dolls is the same thing as taking gender studies. In other words, you do have some generic engagement with gender, but it doesn't get into the muck and the mire of how gender works. So in other words, at a time period in the academy where men are articulated in a certain way in the dominant space, you had a replication of that in terms of some of the publications early on, but that doesn't necessarily reflect an understanding of masculinity, manhood, and the experiences of men. Often at a certain point in time, some scholars would use terms like men to stand in for the community. But this idea that manhood was actually being studied, analyzed, and engaged empirically, that is not the case, which is why Black male studies is so different from
Right.
just Black studies, because there's actually an examination of boyhood, manhood, what it means, so on and so forth, and the experiences of men. A lot of people don't want that discussion to take place, nor are they interested in having gender studies programs welcome a Black male studies component, because
Right.
it flies in the face of that. My courses used to be cross-listed with the women's studies department at Fresno State. Not anymore.
Very interesting. And it goes, I think it goes back to, just in this society, whether or not we want to believe it, it's just Black masculinity that's operating and thriving is a threat,
Mhm.
to the powers that be, whoever that may be. Like,
Right.
it's just so, it makes sense that there would be such an effort on so many levels to try to hinder that, and to
Mhm.
the point to where, there's even be division created within our own community to keep that from flourishing.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Absolutely, especially a flourishing discourse that critically analyzes feminism and Black feminism in turn. And
mhm.
that's something that a lot of people, because it's okay to analyze feminism as long as you're doing so along the parameters of feminism. But if you're examining feminism from outside of feminism, it's a problem. And so when Black men begin to engage in gender analyses publicly, now Black scholars, there's many a Black male scholar that you, like I said, you get them to a conference, get them drunk, sit down and start talking. They know a lot of the stuff we're talking about, but they won't say it publicly for fear of retribution and loss of
Interesting.
career. But when you actually publicly examine these things from a non-feminist framework, let alone a Black male studies framework, it raises a lot of questions that a lot of people don't want to ask.
Interesting. And you even said, like, you were trained, right? Or feminism,
Mhm.
like that was your study. And presumably because there wasn't a lot of Black male studies before, or was it just that all the Black male studies you said had a feminist stance and didn't have another perspective?
No, right. Not at all. Not at all. There was only mainly one. You do have womanism, but for the most part, yeah, it's not received anywhere near the way feminism is.
Fair. And that's actually onto my next question. Do you consider Africana womanists to be allies?
You know, I would say yes if you're looking at the Valethia Watkins, if you're looking at the Brenda Verners, but even the Julia Hares. But the problem is, how many of those women do we still see? When I go to conferences and I run into women that identify as womanists, when you listen to their rhetoric, it's almost indistinguishable from feminist rhetoric.
Mm.
Whereas in the early '90s, you couldn't put womanists and feminists on the same panel without a battle jumping off. The womanists didn't play that, but it's a very different framework today where the lines of the between the two are virtually non-existent in many respects,
Mm-hmm.
unless again you're going to the actual publications of some of these women who have been doing this womanist work for a long time. But it's a very thin line these days from people who identify. And so when I teach womanism in my class, 99.9% of the Black women that take my class have never heard of it before, and they
Yeah.
have a feminist framework, even if they can't tell you they've ever read a feminist, and that goes back to media. So.
I've heard that before too, where it's like how, there's many women who don't identify as a feminist and they've
Mhm,
never read a literature,
mhm.
but it's like just the culture itself
Yeah,
is feminist leaning, that it's like you don't have to read a book
yeah.
to have adopted some of those ideologies.
Well,
Uh,
and that was Oprah, right? Oprah. I mean, radical Black feminists were a very obscure, weird little group in the academy. There's only a small population of people that were reading, Patricia Hill Collins, even Audre Lorde. It was you really had to have taken a class in many respects and been in that circle. Oprah kind of flooded that out to the Black community as a whole. So where you had people that didn't identify as feminists, like my mother. My mother's never read Bell Hooks. She's never read Patricia
right.
Hill Collins, but her talking points are Black feminist talking points because
Mhm.
that's what she got from popular media, and much of that was filtered through Oprah.
Fair. Fair. I mean, that makes so much sense. Um, Now, is there evidence to suggest that Black men are inherently misogynist, violent, and abusive towards their women.
Look, when you look at the population, the data on abuse, right? We talked about this earlier with intimate partner violence. The majority of it is bidirectional.
Yeah.
When you look at intimate partner homicide, you'll find that a lot of the issues that go on, and shout out to Dr. Curry on that, he talks about these as environmentally kind of framed. In other words, you're talking about poverty, you're talking about alcohol, drug abuse that spawns a lot of this. So whereas you can find low numbers of men who are engaged in abuse at higher levels than other communities, you'll also find Black women who are engaged in higher levels of abuse in relation to other groups of women. And that's not because Black men or women are inherently tied to abuse. It's because these are products of our environmental conditions. But when you really look at it, especially when you start talking about homicide, you're really only looking at a couple of hundred people per year, men and women, who are dying at the hands of their partner. So, as a good sociologist once said to me, you really stand a chance of being struck by lightning more so than you do by being killed by your significant other. It's very small. But again, Black men are put on a national stage when they engage in killing a spouse, right? So we've all seen the case in the last couple of days of the gentleman who committed murder suicide. I'm going to be talking about this on my show tomorrow night. That's been blasted all over the papers, but we don't see those same stories when women are killing them. There have been so many stories of this in the last year. The pandemic has really stressed couples out, and you're seeing an increase in intimate partner violence, intimate partner homicide across the board. I've laid out case after case of women killing their spouses, sometimes for simply walking in and catching their wives in bed with another man, not responding with violence, packing a bag, leaving, and the wife shooting him for leaving. Those cases don't get international attention.
I've seen some crazy, and this is not even just within the Black community. I saw something the other day of a young, I think a white woman who would stabbed her baby to death, and she was like, "Yeah, I do it again. It was a sacrifice for my sins." Like just creepy. So it's like and I also did I studied this a few months ago, and I did a video called basically, are Black men the most violent? Because I was hearing this propaganda more and more and more, and I wanted to do my own research. And so what I found after doing that in that video was that basically, to your point, bidirectional violence is really consistent across the board, and from all ethnicities that I found, when we look at white communities, Black communities, Latina communities, those ones specifically were highlighted in the study that I looked at. They showed that women were initiating the violence across the board. They're initiating it more. In Black communities, white, all of them were the first to initiate the violence. And so I was personally shocked, just because anytime I hear domestic violence, anytime I hear it DV, it is literally 100% of the time it is focused on women and women being abused. And when I did that report, I found it like, wow, not only are women fighting back, right, they are, in many instances, they are fighting first. And that to me just was just mind-boggling. I that was not what I was expecting to find. I'll say that.
The man who I just mentioned, who killed his girlfriend and his ex-girlfriend, his ex-wife, one of the things he said when he recorded himself before he killed himself was that his wife had been keeping his kids from him. And his girlfriend said, "I'm going to do the same thing to you with our kid," because she was pregnant at the time. She said, "I'm going to do the same thing with this kid that your ex-wife did to you." And he snapped, right? So when you talk about instigating, it doesn't come out of nowhere. But, again, we don't generally consider psychological abuse or even verbal abuse as a thing unless it's happening to women. There's some discussion around how men can be psychologically abusive. We don't really pay much attention to women being psychologically abusive. So the clock starts, the camera comes on when he responds physically. But everything that happened prior to that, even in regard to physical abuse initiated by women, is not considered part of the discourse. Abuse doesn't happen until he physically responds. Everything other than that is it isn't even picked up by the radar, so to speak.
So you're saying it's possible that there's even more violence happening from the hands of women towards men, but it's not even put on the radar until the women. Okay.
I mean, if you look at the 1960s, when you look at a woman like, I think Erin Pizzey is her name, she talked about setting up some of the first women's shelters. When you look at the interview, she said women didn't understand why the shelter, like the culture around the shelters. In other words, women had to be taught what it meant to be abused. And when she started bringing the first groups of women in and she started asking about the nature of the abuse, the women were, she pointed out, she said the women were often just as abusive and often started the violence with their men, attacking them with bats and knives.
Yep.
And she was surprised to hear this. But then what you got to also consider is from the 70s onward, really in media culture, we were inundated with movies and films about women being stalked and raped and attacked by men.
Yeah, that's true.
That's how we've been trained to see intimate partner violence. Go look up videos on YouTube where they stage with actors, they stage violence from men to women and from women to men in public spaces. 99.9% of the time, when women are violent, people ignore it. When men are violent, other men will come beat up the actors. They literally have to put cameras down and say, no, this was staged, because other men, strange men who don't even know this woman will come out of nowhere to protect her. But if a woman is physically violent, men will actually, groups of people will circle around them and laugh at him. So that's the way we receive it. And much of that has to do with the way we were introduced to the idea of violence. And it was always one way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's, yeah. It's not surprising. It's just, going back to the programming, it's like, here we are. Here we are. And just the way that it's been so subtle and yet it's been so consistent, and it's brought about so much damage. I mean, it's mind-boggling when you really think about how, I guess, like I said, how, I don't want to say complex, but just the different levels that it's gone through to really get to this point.
Well, I think fundamentally part of the idea goes back to an old chivalrous framework where we don't believe that women can hurt men. I think that's partly what we're dealing with. And you have a lot of men that have this belief that that a woman can't hurt me. Look, there was a case, I want to say last year, where you had an older woman, right? She got some kind of bucket of heated water with sugar in it, and she threw it on her husband while he slept.
Oh my gosh.
What it did is it separated the skin from his body. And he eventually died of his wounds. And she walked next door, knocked on the door, and said, I just killed my husband. People don't think of how vulnerable men can be, because somehow we have this idea that men are these macho, superpowered guys that can't be hurt by women when it's convenient. But all of a sudden, women can be victims at any point in time. And then media tells you women and men are the same. There's no differences. So there's this very confusing network, but it tends to be malleable when it comes to highlighting female innocence or female victimization. And so you have men that suffer at the hands of abuse. Hell, there was just another case I saw today in Africa of a man who had his penis cut off because his girlfriend sent pictures to his wife of them in bed. So when he got home, he lied about where he was. She made love to him. They ate dinner. They went to sleep, and she cut his penis off in the middle of the night.
Oh, that situation. I remember that was a few years ago on The View, I think, where there was women who were laughing about it, and man who was castrated, and she put it in the blender, and they're all laughing, and I'm like,
oh yeah.
I do not promote, I don't promote adultery, but I'm like, if that was the other way around and a man had, cut off the breast of it, like just
or cut out her uterus in response.
Yeah, that
nobody's laughing about that.
So
but you can go watch Girls Trip, right? And they're cutting up sausages to mimic, doing that to a man, and it's a joke, and everybody's laughing. I'm like, there's no point in time where a man can even pretend to cut up a woman's uterus, even if it's in response to being cheated on, where that would be received, right? So we have this kind of one-way morality about abuse and about victimization that nobody wants to talk about, honestly.
Absolutely. Well, we're almost done to the last questions. For those of you who are on, again, please get those likes up, and I appreciate all of you who sent in some love. But thank you for the 99-cent super sticker. Much love. And also Infinity FMG for the $5 super chat. Much love. So we're almost done. It says, what are the ways that Black male scholars can navigate through a racist academy?
It takes a lot of strategy. It is a game of chess, and often I tell, especially Black male studies scholars, you got to get tenure before you can really come out. So you got to be extremely strategic. I sit on a number of people's PhD panels because a lot of them are finding that if they reference Black male studies in their work, sometimes they'll be called out publicly, sometimes it will not be it won't be an outward discussion. They'll just find themselves hitting a glass ceiling and never being able to graduate. And I can't tell you how many graduate students have reached out to tell me these stories where they have mainly Black women on their panels, because if you look at the educational rates, that's what you're seeing. And those Black women are not supporting them if they're using Black male studies information. So they have to be extremely strategic. And if they can't get a Black male studies scholar to help protect them on their boards, they're going to actually have to, kind of get out best they can. And it's usually not until they get tenure before they can really start to say the things that they want to say. But here's the rub. Even when you get tenure, what ends up happening is you're not always able to move around after that. So wherever you get tenure, you better be happy, because once you start going public, and hopefully that's changing, but as of what I know, you're kind of stuck where you are. This is one of the reasons I'm at Fresno. Dr. Curry had to go to Scotland to do this work, because we were applying for jobs at different campuses and getting down to the top 2 on a regular basis. And then after getting denied, somebody from the job committee, from the committee, the hiring committee, would pull you aside and say, this is what happened in closed door session. And it wasn't about your publications. It wasn't about this or that. It was strictly about your stance against feminism. And so that's kind of the resistance that you'll get. Now, again, maybe that's changing, but from what I can see, be very strategic. Make sure you get tenure and be prepared to sit where you are for a while if you get that tenure, because it's an uphill battle when it comes to advocating for Black men and boys in the academy.
Well, and that's basically it. Sounds like what you're saying. What the academy is supposed to be a place, right, where you can have free thought and you can look at different ideas, ideologies, different thoughts and whatever, and compare it and have a critical analysis, and not be threatening, but you also come to your own conclusion. That's what's supposed to happen. But in reality, it sounds like there are certain things that you have found that just cannot be critiqued. It's just status quo. You just can't do it.
No, the academy, and think about it this way: the academy is the basis where policy eventually comes out of, right? The thinkers that students are introduced to in one decade are the ideas that are pushed in electoral politics and in activism the following decade. So the academy in and of itself is the idea machine that shapes public policy over a period of time. So it is highly political space, and which ideas get entertained is a highly fraught and political issue, which is why you may find yourself relegated to a very low position, even if they can't fire you, if you're propagating certain ideas that are not popular. And why, if you don't have tenure or some other kinds of dynamics are in play, you'll find yourself out of work entirely, because it is so political, and the politics of what can happen from the academy are so powerful. It's very governed, very watched over, and highly fraught. So that it's not an innocent space by any means.
That is good to know. That is good to know. I do know of one gentleman in particular who's studying, I think African American studies at a university, and he's kind of shared his struggles with how everything has been about feminism. Like almost everything has been about African American women and their experience. And he's like, this is supposed to be something that we're supposed to be looking at the overall community, men and women. And why is it that every professor, every person, everything I look at, it is all about women? This is a Black man, who's in college right now talking about it. So very
I have professors, chairs of departments. I even have university presidents that will reach out to me, and under the table they will tell me the same exact thing. The ideas are supposed to be universal. You're supposed to be able to offer them, but those they're mostly men, but there have been women that have said if they come out and say something publicly, their jobs are in question, their reputations are in question, and they have to worry.
Absolutely. Now, down to the last question. What are some Black masculinity textbooks that you would recommend?
I think the two that I push the most, the first of which is Dr. Tommy J. Curry's The Man Not. That it's got to be your first stop for Black male studies. I would also highly suggest Siri McDougall's Black Men Studies text. From those to me are the two starting points that I highly recommend people look at first when coming into the field. And then you have a series of others that, especially if you go through Curry's, you'll see plenty of references to individual scholars. Sometimes they're doing papers and journals, things of that nature. But I think the starting point is Curry, the Man Not, and then I would look at McDougall's work on Black men studies.
Okay. I'm taking notes here. um, well, I mean, this was such a rich conversation. I learned so much. I'm sure all of the followers did learn so much. Do you have any other, any final words, any final thoughts, or anything that you would like to share with the audience tonight?
Well, I really hope that people will support, whether it's a book or whether it's a YouTube channel, and support Black male studies wherever you find it. I also have a YouTube channel and a website for the Institute for Black Male Studies. I definitely hope they support that. But these things need to be supported overall because
Mm,
for the most part, there's very little institutional support. Again, the only one I can think of that has some degree of institutional support is Dr. Curry. Short of
okay.
that, very little. So and even the discussion going on in the manosphere. Here's the thing: the two are not the same. Black male studies and the manosphere are not necessarily the same. But I
Hmm.
would argue that they're both produced by a movement of men who are starting to respond in the social environment, in the political environment, in the academic environment in ways they never had before. You had scholars like Ishmael Reed in the 80s, Robert Staples in the 70s that were pushing some of this. And I would recommend reading those men as well, especially Staples. But you really didn't have a wave or a surge of support that pushed them. So they were operating out there by themselves in many respects. What you have now is a wave of men, most of whom are not in the academy, that are reading Dr. Curry's Man Not, that are supporting Dr. McDougall's book, because there's a movement happening that we haven't seen the likes of since the late 60s, early 70s with
Yeah.
women.
Hmm.
And because of that movement, there's so much more going on. And because of its newness and its vibrancy, some of it is going to be in your face, some of it's going to be offensive, some of it
Yeah.
is going to be enlightening. But at the end of the day, it's going to be messy because this has been a discussion that has been avoided and tamped down for
Yes.
generations, and it threatens the boundaries of how we define African Americanity. It threatens how we define gender roles. It threatens, I mean, everything is on the table and up for grabs. So join in on this discussion, listen, get the ideas, get the terminology and the concepts so that you understand where men are coming from, even if you yourself are a Black male, and really begin to join into this movement, because it's going to change things one way or another.
Right. So
It already
basically, educate yourself, support those who are educating, who are getting those issues out there, who
is.
are really trying to push the conversation forward. To
Yes.
your point, this is such a new thing, and so it's going to be messy, it's going to be sloppy, and we have to have a little bit of grace. I think someone mentioned earlier, or Snuggles mentioned Tommy Sotomayor. I'm not familiar with him. I haven't really seen his work. I've heard he's a bit abrasive, but I
Mhm.
also understand, to your point, whenever you have, what did they say? It's like a hit dog hollers, right? Where it's like you hit somebody, you hurt somebody, like the
Mhm.
reaction is to scream and to yell. And if you have a particular people group, right, men, women, I mean, this is why you think about like Me Too, right, where it's like all these women are saying
Mhm.
they've been silenced and abused, and it's so pervasive. And I'm like, that is a natural response. So if men that feel like they've been silenced, African American men in particular feel like they've been silenced, there
Mhm.
has to be a space, I think, for us to come in and hear some of these different things, even if it's hard. I think, and even if sometimes it comes off rough, I think just being willing to engage and say, okay, my entire life I've heard a specific narrative by nature of just being in America, being in the West. I have
Mhm.
by nature heard a feminist narrative. I've heard things from one point of view. It would behoove me to listen to somebody else to see if I could learn or maybe grow or maybe even need to change something.
Mhm.
So I even tell women, it's like, you know what, just sometimes we have to look past the tone. Sometimes we have to just for a few minutes say, okay, are the merits of what he's saying valid?
But
And start there.
no, and that's incredibly important. But the funny part to me is how frustrated people are about a 20-minute YouTube video. I literally sat in classes for from what 1992 to 2008 doing my bachelor's through my doctorate. I sat in classes at the university where I heard the same level of vitriol, if not more, coming from established scholars. I mean, I don't care if you're talking about, look from Audre Lorde to Brittany Cooper. Go look at some of the comments about men, about manhood, about Black men in particular, in regard to, from bell hooks on. Look at from media productions and films, from Oprah all the way through to academics, from then to now. And you're talking about guys on YouTube that you have a problem with? I mean, I went to movie theaters to get some of this same stuff. My mother dragged me to watch movies in theaters where I could see the same kind of misandry from Terry McMillan to Tyler Perry. And I'm like, we've been absorbing this misandry for decades. And really, it's only in the last year that most people who have been introduced to the manosphere are responding with this level of shock and awe. And I'm like, you're upset about some guys on YouTube that you've never heard of before, and yet celebrities from the last 4 decades are still making millions off of misandry, and this is a shock to you? Wow.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, there's just there are certain things. There's a certain level of disrespect that is generally accepted for men in general in the society, and then especially for Black men, that it's like we don't even think twice when we see certain things.
Right.
So
even over Twitter, where Black men are being called out as bullet bags, that's acceptable, right? But
I didn't know that. I'm not really on Twitter like that. And the first time I heard that, I was like, are you kidding? Have we lost our mind? Like, that's something that I would expect a neo-Nazi to say.
Exactly.
That should not be commonplace language among Black women. Like, how disrespectful and self-hating is that?
But we all, especially if you came up in the 80s and 90s, we were familiar with that time period's version of that statement, whereas N-words ain't, I don't want to cuss on your show.
Yeah, appreciate it.
That language has been around, and I've heard it from family members. I've heard it from friends. But that popular type of anti-Black misandry has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that you can't find, acts of misogyny, but you damn sure can find very little critique of misandry.
And that's what I hope to get around. My point isn't to act like women's pain doesn't exist and that there isn't issues out there. There certainly is, but I just think the conversation is so one-sided. It's like, okay, in order for there to be balance and a honest discussion about how to even hope to do better and move forward, you have to look at both sides. You have to look at the problem in its entirety. And if you just hyper focus on one thing, then you're never going to be able to move forward because you can never get to the root problem.
Well, in one sense, one could say that I do. And I've had people just reach out to me with such anger. And why aren't you more balanced? Why don't you point out what women are experiencing? I'm like, I got a YouTube channel and you just got through watching CNN. We are not on the same level. The things you want me to talk about are prominent in the news. The things I'm pointing out are, you might find a news report that came out last year about it, but it's never been followed up on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I'm like, I over invest in terms of analyzing that because there's nothing to counterbalance it. It's not really, so that's kind of my thing where people really want to push a certain type of equality. And I'm saying, well, if you really want to talk about equality, we're far away from it. We're really far away. A lot of Black men watch my show to get the news that pertains to them that they're not getting in mainstream media. So when people ask me, well, why don't you do more stuff on Black women and from their vantage point, I'm like, you got plenty of channels for that. You got television channels, you got magazines, you got movies, you got films, you got TV shows. You have an academic legacy going back 4 decades at least. Black men don't have that.
Yeah, no, I understand. Well, and also too, it's like, for example, I'm a channel, I speak primarily to women. So it's like, I'm going to highlight issues that I see related within Black women. Right. I wanted to bring you on because obviously relationships is a largely important component. And our relationship with Black men, I think, is a topic that needs to be explored because it's just so ding toxic. Like, I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah.
So, but of course, but I'm like, I'm not going to I think it would be inappropriate for me to spend majority of my time talking about men all the time, because it's like, that's not my space. That's what
Right.
men are for. So it's like, I don't understand why you're a man. You should speak about men things. You know what I mean? At least as far as I see it. Not to say you can't dialogue about how your interactions are with a woman, but it's like, ultimately, I would think that that would be, your focus, because that's
You'd be surprised how many women will come into my space all the way up through Kevin Samuels and tell us what we should be talking about. In other words, shifting the conversation back to Black women, because that's the norm that they've become familiar with. And to talk about and prioritize Black men is considered inherently a problem, right? Just for the gesture itself. So, yeah, it's definitely an uphill battle as far as being able to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what's going to continue to happen, and we're going to continue these kinds of conversations and things, hoping. And my hope is that this really does, for those who really do want to do better. I know there's going to be people out there who are they're just going to hate the whole way through. It is what it is. But for those who genuinely want to see change and genuinely want to see there be some form of resolve, I hope these kinds of things, even if they're tough, even if they're uncomfortable, can really start to lead to some larger discussions and actions on different things that people can do individually and on a larger scale to hopefully bring some change here. So
well, and we all have to take part in it in our own way. I know for me, one of the big things that I'm focused on is really trying to produce the vocabulary, the terminology, because I found, and Dr. Curry and I talked about this a lot over the last number of years, the concepts and terms that we were given to explore gender were rooted in women's experiences, and they didn't lend themselves to men's very well. So we've been actually developing new concepts and theories and ideas that focus on men's experiences. And what I'm trying to do with my channel is familiarize people with that language, especially Black men themselves. And I can't tell you how many of them reached out to me and said, yes, I went to the Christmas dinner, my family's Thanksgiving dinner, and usually the men are kind of browbeaten to silence. But when I started to kind of use these concepts and terminology, it forced people to rethink their position, and it created a whole different type of discussion. And that's really what I'm trying to do. So that's, another reason why I'm kind of focused on men and boys the way I am, because I want to get this out so people have the means to communicate ideas and feelings that they've had, but haven't had the language to articulate.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. Well, I mean, like I said, this has been a great, fruitful discussion. I've learned so much. I'm sure everybody who's listening has. As mentioned before, I will be sure to leave. You said you have a website also?
Yeah, I mean, I have several. There's, I can actually put them in the chat if you like. But
okay, yeah, because I think I've left like your social media, but I'd love to also leave your website information, anything else you have, so people want to support you, follow you, whatever they can. As mentioned before, we want to keep these conversations going and get the message out there. Definitely support those who are actually trying to help, support and build Black men, and also bring, healing and bring some perspective and give them a voice, because I think that is just as important. That also needs to be elevated. We want to hear Black women, doing well. We want to see their issues put in the platform, and I think Black men deserve it as well. And I say that as a Black woman. It's like I don't believe that there should be such a division or such this divide. So
well, and if I could say just quickly, well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on.
My pleasure.
And I wish your channel well in terms of its growth. But the other thing I just wanted to say is my attempt to help develop the language for Black men is one of the solutions to these issues that I'm trying to put forth. And another is if you look at the first, I think it's the second link I put up in the chat, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. The featured pinned article is for the Black male political agenda. And these are policies and these are policy proposals that Black men have sent in to actually address the quality of Black male life politically. So I know people like to dismiss what we're saying because there's no solutions, and really that's a deflective tactic. There are plenty of solutions. Even the discourse itself is a solution. But if you really want to look at what Black men are thinking and feeling, especially politically, look at the Black male political agenda and look at how many ways Black men have found themselves on the outs legally, and what kind of solutions they're proposing.
Okay. You said you sent this in the
I
drop this
put
in
it,
the
yeah,
comment?
I put it in the chat on YouTube in the private. I mean, in the live chat. So
Okay. Okay. Well, I will see if I can go and find
as
it.
well as my own personal website. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll see if I can. I don't know why it's not coming up here, but it could be. I just got to give a few
So you
seconds.
might have to scroll up a little. Oh, you're doing it on StreamYard. I see what you're yeah.
Yeah. Also, if you don't mind, maybe you can just email it to me, and then I can just copy and paste it in the description. So
Okay.
maybe you can handle it that way.
Thank
So,
you.
well, anyways, this has been amazing. Again, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us and just sharing your knowledge. And like I said, I've learned so much. I have different things I can check out, different literature. I think I actually already have Man Out in my house, believe it or not. I feel like my husband has that. So that's already on my list of things to read into further and explore. So
Okay.
this has been so helpful, so fruitful, and I hope everybody who listens to this and who was going to listen to this learned a little bit of something, and have some perspective. Is maybe challenged to really think through how they've been processing things and whether or not there's some room for growth there. So
Absolutely. And again, thank you for having me on. I wish your channel the best. And if there's anything else I can do to help, let me know.
absolutely, thank you again so much, and enjoy the rest of your night.
You as well.
Okay, you take care. Well, again, I want to thank all of you guys who have joined me tonight. This is probably one of the longest streams that I've done, but it was so fruitful, so helpful. I do see that I got some new super chats in. Again, a special shout out. Special shout out to Miss Delta Guy for the $100 super chat. Much love, much love. I appreciate all of your guys' support. Looks like I think I have a few more in there I don't want to overlook. There was another, again, for the $50 super chat. Again, I see great show. We need more dialogues like this. I could not agree more. We need more dialogues like this. And again, I appreciate all of you guys who are on, who have shared this, who have sent in your comments. I'm gonna say this. My hope and my goal is to continue to have constructive conversations, and just informative discussions in general, so that we can help to bridge the gap. Although, as I mentioned before, my channel definitely focuses and speaks to Black women, but yeah, we need to know how to get along with our men. It is what it is. We need to know how to learn how to get along with our men. Many of us have not been taught. Many of us have been sold all kinds of propaganda, or we're just trauma bonding, and there's just a big, deep divide. And so I think it's important that we actually start to have a listening ear, that we start to listen things from the other perspective, and start to actually have a fruitful dialogue. It's okay to not have all the answers, and it's okay sometimes to be criticized. Receiving a little bit of criticism doesn't mean that you're evil, doesn't mean that you're bad, but it means that, hey, maybe there's room for growth, and that's what adults do. So I think even as a Black woman, I think it's good and healthy to be in a place where we can say, hey, maybe everything that I've learned hasn't been the best. Maybe some of the things that I believed have been detrimental, how I can look into that. And while we certainly demand that Black men do those things, as they should, Black men should also be introspective. Black men should also look at the different ways that maybe they have believed lies about themselves, or done things that have been harmful. They should do the same thing. But if we're requiring that of them, then we need to also make sure that we are also requiring that of ourselves. There has to be accountability on both sides. So, like I said, my goal is to continue to do this. Also, for those of you who have not already, if you would like to see more positive content, and if you would like to specifically see content that is dedicated to sharing, promoting, and talking about the different contributions Black men have made to the society, we're talking about, advancements in, engineering, technology, medicine, just institutionally, different inventions, just different ways that Black men have positively impacted and built the society. If that is something that you would like to take a part of, if you want to see more video content dedicated to that, feel free to sign up to become a channel member. We're actively campaigning for that right now. The goal is to get at least 300 supporters so that we can have enough resources to start to turn that into a video series that is going to start to fight against some of this one-sided propaganda. As many of you know, you've heard time and time and time and time again, Black men don't build, Black men are dusties, Black men are that, they're not this, they're not this. And I just think for me, it's important that we start to actually have encouraging dialogues about some of the good things that have happened. While it is definitely true that there is still so much that needs to happen, there are a lot of things that need to be addressed. Behavioral wise, there's issues, we all know it. We don't talk enough about some of the good things that men are doing, and we don't celebrate those who have done good things and continue to do so. And so my hope is to also promote those men and promote those people who are doing good things, because I think that's healthy, not only just for us to understand, but just overall sense of self-esteem. If y'all have sons, y'all have young brothers, young cousins, whatever, and they're young Black boys, they need to know that there are men out there who are doing good things, and they're not just destined to be drug addicts or incarcerated. They need to know that they can do things beyond just being an athlete or just being a rapper, that they can be a mathematician, they can have inventions, they can, they can build things. They need to know that there are men that look like them that have also contributed in all these different areas. We don't see that being celebrated. So again, that is something that I would like to do. If this is something that interests you, and you again want to be a part of seeing that video series and start to fight against this propaganda, sign up to become a channel member. You can do so for as low as $4.99. Again, I want to thank all of you who have already done so and who just have stopped by to just hang out with me tonight. I really appreciate you. Again, hit the like button if you haven't already, and feel free to hit the subscribe button, and we are going to have many more fruitful conversations. In the meantime, you have a good night, and we will talk later. Bye.